Hello, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. Alcohol abuse is a scourge on modern society. In the United States alone, over 178,000 people each year die due to alcohol abuse, and over $200 billion is lost from the economy due to the effects of alcohol abuse, either increased healthcare costs or lost productivity or even crime enforcement. Given that, it's kind of remarkable that this is a disease for which there's claimed to be no cure. The only approach has been to basically help people abstain for life from drinking. Once they're an alcoholic, they can never have a drink again. Given that, I was extremely happy in this episode to be able to have a dialogue with journalist Katie Herzog. I've enjoyed Katie's writing for years, but I was particularly happy to have her on this program because she's written a new book called Drink Your Way Sober, the science-based method to break free from alcohol. And this is remarkable because the book discusses what could be considered to be a cure for alcohol abuse. It involves a simple scientific idea, namely the use of an opioid blocker, in this case something called Naltrexone, that reduces the joy from drinking. And one can take this pill a few hours before drinking and behaviorally produce over time a lost craving for alcohol that allows at least some users to have a reasonable alcohol consumption for the rest of their life without having to abstain forever. Now, what makes this particularly interesting is that Katie discusses this not just as a journalist, but Katie's been an alcoholic for most of her life, and the use of naltrexone has helped cure her alcoholism. And so this is a fascinating story because it's personal. Her personal story is interjected with the science, and that's one of the things I particularly find useful about this episode, because one of the purposes of the Origins podcast and of the foundation I run is to connect science and culture. And this is a beautiful way to do just that, discussing how the science of opioid blockers and behavioral techniques can be used in principle to affect a huge cultural issue like alcohol abuse. I wanted to talk to Katie, not just about her experience as an alcoholic, but her early life, what led her to that, and also what led her to a career in journalism. And the discussion was as fascinating as informative as I hoped it would be. I'm sure you'll find it incredibly enjoyable and potentially useful. And you can watch it ad-free on our Substack site, Critical Mass. And if you subscribe to that site, the subscription fees go to support the Origins Project Foundation, the nonprofit foundation that produces this podcast. You can also watch it for free if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can watch it or listen to it on any podcast listening site. No matter how you watch it or listen to it, I hope you'll find this provocative and inspiring, at least as provocative and inspiring as I did in having that conversation. So with no further ado, Katie Herzog. Well, welcome to the Origins Podcast, and I'm extremely excited today to be able to talk to Katie Herzog, who I followed for a while, and I now feel I know her after reading her book, which is called Drink Your Way Sober, and we'll be talking about this along with other things. Katie, it's great to virtually meet you.
Nice to meet you as well, Lawrence. I sense it's been an interesting few weeks for you.
Oh, it's been an interesting few months or a few years,
Yeah, few
and
years.
yeah, and we'll get. But I know you want to be a journalist, and and that's good. And I've read your writing as a journalist. You know, your famous detransition paper article, which you got sort of canceled for, right?
hmm
It was an interesting and I thought not dogmatic article about people who detransition and what their experience is and the fraction that do and don't. And it was kind of a fun thing, but it's such a emotionally charged topic that you really got lambasted for it, I guess, eh?
I did, yeah. This was in 2017, so I was at the time I was a freelancer for The Stranger, so that was the all weekly in Seattle. And the I mean, it was a cancellation campaign. I don't think that word had emerged from the lexicon yet, but there was a, big online pile on, both online and offline.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, so there were stickers in my neighborhood calling me a transphobe and at one
Ooh.
point a Jordan Peterson apologist. I wrote a piece saying that I didn't think he was a Nazi. I thought he was sort of a um, y- in some ways a bit of a cult leader, and
Uh-huh.
maybe somewhat of a charlatan, but not a Nazi.
Yeah.
And
I've had
yeah, there
Jordan
was
on, and
Mhm.
And I know him. Yeah, I think you hit it right.
And of course, things have changed so quickly over the past few years. My take on detransition in 2017 would not be my take on detransition in 2026. I know a lot more about it now, but the piece was very careful, and I said things in the piece that now I think were inaccurate about like rates of regret,
Yeah,
which we
uh-huh.
don't actually know. But I sort of parroted some activist talking points. I was very careful in the piece, but people got quite mad about it. But it was great for my career, so, you
Yeah,
know,
well, it
win
got
and
a lot of
lose.
attention. So
Yeah.
being canceled was good for you.
Mhm. No, it absolutely was good for me in terms of my career. Personally, it was more difficult, so
Yeah.
I lost a lot of friends, a lot of old friends, and that will never stop being painful to be abandoned by people
Yeah,
who I'm
that's the
sure
hardest
that you
part.
have I'm sure you're very familiar with that.
Yeah, yeah.
And, so that part was difficult, but professionally, my cancellation was the best thing that has ever happened to me. I feel like I need to send my critics a fruit basket sometime. They
You
made
should.
my
I'm
career,
sure
yeah.
they would appreciate it. I mean, they get the message. I mean,
They'd accuse
it
me
can
of
wear
doxing them.
it doesn't always work that way, and yeah,
No.
for many of us, I've seen it. But there were things I know this isn't about that piece, but I was kind of surprised that you said between this was interesting to me that because the a key issue now is sort of that I've been involved with my book, The War on Science, and we had a number of doctors talking about the basically the lack of medical evidence for the utility of gender affirming care.
Mhm.
And in spite of what people say, they quote studies that are just not studies.
Right.
But I was interested to learn that when children, that people who sort of want to trans when they're children, I don't know if this is still true, but in that article, there were like between 67 and 80% of the kids who think about transitioning with the kids end up staying with
Desisting.
their sex,
Yeah.
their birth sex,
Yeah,
which
so
is
that
kind
was
of it.
that was based on older studies. I'm sure the data has changed at this point, and that was I was basically summarizing some of James Cantor's work.
Yeah.
But what they found in the early studies, so these were mostly studies coming out of Holland, what they found was that most kids who came to gender clinics would eventually grow out of it, basically when they hit puberty, and most of them turned out to be gays and lesbians.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important for parents to hear, I think. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting fact, but we've jumped ahead because we've already been to we'll get to your podcast in a bit, but the can your career as a journalist, but I want to go back and ask how you got to where you are. And
Mhm.
I know you in this book where I learned a lot about you, but I was going to say more than you want to know, but obviously not more than you want to know because you obviously wrote it
I put
down
it in the book,
so we'd
yeah.
all know.
Mhm.
I know you went to college, but I want to go back before that. In fact, you pointed out that the when we were talking before that picture behind you is from your dad's book. I want to find out about your parents. What
Yeah.
your dad was an academic or no?
Both my parents are academics. My dad was, in the psych department both my parents were at a sort of B-level state school in North Carolina. My dad, his field is he's in the psych department, but his field is human-animal interaction, so it's called the formal name is anthrozoology, and the picture in my background, that's the cover of his book in German. The book's called Some We Love, Some We Hate, Some We Eat: Why It's So Hard to Think Straight About Animals, and he's I am my father, much to my wife's chagrin in some ways, but he's very interested in why in human behavior and why we do and think the things that we do, and I absorbed a lot of that growing up.
Yeah, we
Um
know when you talk about your father now, and you don't talk about it in the book. I mean, it resonates because it's clear. I was going to say the book, your approach to these things, it sounds very much like what you're talking about with your father.
Mhm.
By the way, who is not an alcoholic, I assume.
No, he's not.
Okay,
He's
and
not.
your mother's an academic too.
Yeah, my mom, she taught in the English department or the, education department at her university, so she
So the
teaches
child of
master's students.
academics, did you
Yes.
ever did you want to I remember with my daughter, it turned I mean, well, it'd be interesting to hear what you say. You either want to be or it turns you
Mhm.
off. Uh,
I didn't my parents always told me they're slightly older than you, but so you guys came of age at the same time roughly. And at that time, from what I observed from my parents, this was a really good time to be an academic. So my dad, he served in the military during Vietnam. He was not drafted. He enlisted to avoid getting sent to Vietnam. But when he was released from the military, he had the GI Bill. He went and got his PhD, and there wasn't very much competition. So he applied for a master's program, and when he got his acceptance letter, they crossed out the word master's and wrote in PhD. Right, that's
Yeah.
how competitive it was at the time. And my parents decided that they wanted to live in Western North Carolina, and they got jobs in Western North Carolina. They
Which
got
is a
tenure track. They got exactly what they wanted. They had summers off. They liked their colleagues. They had a
yeah,
lot of freedom. They couldn't get fired, and both of them are sort of contrarian rabble rousers type. They could, probably
yeah.
not best served in corporate America, and so they had great careers. And but by the time my generation came along, it was very clear to them that the golden age was ending, in part
Mhm.
because they taught graduate students. And I think seeing, like, in my dad's department, they had a master's in psych.
Yeah.
What can you do with a master's in
Yeah.
psych, right? You can go get a PhD in psych
Yeah.
or maybe be a social worker or something
You
like
can
that.
you
But
be you could probably be a therapist with a master's in
yeah,
psych.
if you had
Yeah.
clinical, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, And I think he just felt like we're just producing these students who they're not gonna have jobs. A lot of them wanted to be professors, and there just weren't jobs. So I think I sort of dodged the bullet by, not being a
Yeah,
good enough
no,
student
it's
to
a
go into
tough I mean,
academia.
I even and, I'm not sure if your parents are older than me, but we're probably almost contemporary, but at least in my area of physics, by the even at my time, it was already I never expected to get a I did a PhD and I learned how to juggle and drive taxi because I just
Oh,
figured I'd
really?
never get a job because there were no
Mhm.
jobs,
Oh,
and it turned
really?
out yeah, yeah, so there was already at least and that was in the late '70s, early '80s,
Mhm.
and, but yeah, no, it's nice that they were able to get what they wanted, but did you ever think of either well, what did you study in college?
I studied English literature with an emphasis on creative writing.
I okay, good, and so you never thought of doing psych?
I know I took psych classes. I really enjoyed psychology, but I never considered I wanted to be a writer, and I didn't have a plan for how I was gonna be a writer. But I basically wanted to be an essayist. I wanted to be David Sedaris.
So you followed your dream in some sense.
I did. It was a winding path to get
Yeah,
here,
well,
but I did sort of
we'll
yeah,
get to the winding path, which
yeah.
you helped your lifestyle made it more winding. I
I did.
think.
I threw up some barriers for myself along the way for
Yeah,
sure.
that's all right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, as someone who writes, and I loved and I was influenced to become a scientist because of writers. I wanted to write, but it's not the career path I took, and it sort of
Mhm.
always amazed me that it ended up being that way. But did you, they encourage reading? Did with a lot of books?
Yes.
Did you read a lot?
Yes. Lots
Yeah,
of reading, lots of writing from my mom especially. My dad he taught evolutionary psychology, among other things.
which is my favorite part of psychology.
Yeah, and so I would take walks with him, and he would teach me sort of the history of human evolution. By the time I was
Wow.
5 years old, I could lecture people on Lucy and,
Mm, mm.
Australopithecus to Homo
I got to hold
sapien.
Lucy once, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah, well, I
Wow.
mean, the bones about yeah, because
Yeah.
my, both institutions I taught at had Don Johansen who discovered Lucy, so
Wow.
anyway, sorry, go on, but it was neat.
Yeah. So I was very encouraged to pursue at one point I thought I wanted to be an archaeologist. My parents took me or my dad took me to a dig. Turns out
Wow.
archaeology is really boring. So sitting there
It's
with
really,
a
a lot of
brush.
cleaning and a lot of digging and nothing happening, yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And yeah, so I had maybe a slightly atypical childhood just because of who my parents are, but a pretty, pretty standard American
Well,
childhood.
I mean, that's an important point, which we'll get to later. I mean, you had a fine childhood. When we talk about
Mhm.
your alcoholism, it wasn't you didn't have a traumatic existence as
No,
a child, and
no.
that's an important thing what that we'll talk about when we talk about roots of it, or when you talk about roots of it.
Mhm.
Um, but so there were lots of readings, but you didn't. Did you ever take physics, by the way?
I've never taken a physics course.
How
I
did?
was not I'm bad at math. I was terrible at chemistry. I was not a great student. I went to pretty bad schools, so
Uh-huh.
I was good compared to a lot of my peers, but I was not a great student. I was good at history, I was good at sort of the writing things, but not the kind of the more just, like, straightforward analytical.
Yeah, yeah, and
sciences.
it always amazes me you can go through life in high school without taking physics. It just seems tragic.
At my high school, I could have gotten by without taking math.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's amazing. It's
Mhm.
but at least I mean, but I think reading is really important, and a lot of people. I mean, I think that's great when obviously there's a lot of books, a lot of encouragement of reading,
Right.
and the reading helps you want to be a
Right, and of
writer.
course, I'm in my early 40s, so I was raised before smartphones and home
Yeah,
internet, and so just a very different television was very different. In the summer, we basically didn't watch you watch a half hour of TV at night, if that, and then on the summer, you watch nothing because everything on
yeah,
television is reruns and you're left to your own devices. It was just a very
yeah.
different
Yeah.
time than kids are being
You know,
raised now.
I often yeah. I actually watched an incredible amount of television when I was a kid,
Mm,
and I was really important for me. I used to say, I probably said this on one of the podcasts, but I wouldn't recommend this, but I used to, even when there was a TV in my room, and when I was a kid, even
mm.
6, 7, 8, I wouldn't, and later, I wouldn't start my homework till after Johnny Carson ended at 1 a.m.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. And,
Were
but I used to watch old movies and it gave me great cultural knowledge.
so were your parents allowed this? Did you have sort of a
I think
hands-off
well,
parenting?
it was sort of hands-off parenting. My brother, who at the time shared for a long time shared a room with me. He went to bed at 9. I think he still does.
Mm,
It was just different. And I think as long as we were, I mean, we were good kids and we were good in school and all that stuff, and so they didn't really care. And for me,
mhm.
that was great. I mean, for some kids it wouldn't work, but for
Right.
me, the less intrusion I had in my life, the better.
Right. You must have been that must have been a real rarity for a kid to have a bedroom in his room or a TV in his room.
It was a little teeny black
Mhm.
and white that I remember, and then later on, and I learned a lot. I mean, I'm not saying it's good, but I used to learn a lot, and even when I was in high school, I remember I'd wake up early and watch some of the educational
Huh.
networks on TV, and then at night I'd watch Casablanca and stuff. Anyway, it was useful for me, but again, I wouldn't recommend it for everyone.
Right.
So you knew you wanted to go to college though, right? You knew, I mean,
Yeah.
especially with your parents being college
Th
teachers, it was
there was
never a question.
sort of no question. My mom at one point did say to me something like, "Have you considered being a hairdresser?" And I think she sort of knew that I had low motivation. Um, it was never really a question that I would go to college at some point. But I only applied to one college. I chose the one that I didn't have to write an essay for.
Oh.
I was not motivated at all to get into.
Where did you go to college again?
I went to the University of North Carolina at Asheville, so it's
So
a
you in
public liberal
Asheville,
arts
okay, but
school.
your parents
Yeah.
didn't live in Asheville.
They do now. We lived in a town called Cullowhee, so it's like an hour
Okay.
from Asheville.
Asheville's
But
great. We talked about it when we were
mhm,
first talking on the phone. I love Asheville.
yeah.
But I see, so you wanted to stay in North Carolina. You didn't wanna go away.
Well, I couldn't pay for out of state.
Oh, so it was in state, but did
It
you
was
live
in
at
state.
college or did you live at home?
I lived in college for the first year, and then I got an apartment.
Okay. When I went to college, I lived we had to live in the dormitory for the first year.
Yeah,
It was
mine was the
required,
same.
and I was just shocked. It was like institutional alcoholism.
Oh, yeah.
The
Yeah.
university, I mean, right from the very beginning, I couldn't believe they'd put a boys' floor together and a girls' floor, well, that's what we
Yeah.
called them at that time. Um, and they'd give them unlimited amounts of alcohol and basically say, "Get to know each other." And it was really,
Really? So that was
yeah, I just
provided by
thought
the
it was
college?
ridiculous. What?
The alcohol was provided by the college?
But was provided by the dorms. Yeah, it was
Really?
really because this was
Well,
Canada and the drinking age
right.
was 18, so
Right,
so the
right,
kids were,
right.
I mean,
Yeah.
anyway, so it shocked me, but anyway.
At my dorm, you could smoke in your dorm room if your roommate would agree. That was
Oh.
the so it was not that long ago, but it was long enough ago so that you could smoke in a dorm room. Not an airplane, but a dorm room.
Well, I never said this either, but, you're bringing it out of me. This is totally relevant, but I discovered 2/3 of the way through my first year that one room in my floor in the dormitory, no one lived in it. It just had ultraviolet lights and it was used for growing marijuana, the entire room. I didn't, because the only reason I found out about it was because some in one of my chemistry classes, a friend, colleague, asked me, he said, "I heard you could get marijuana from the dorm. Do you know anything about it?" So I asked, and they said, "Oh yeah, it's on your floor. Just go."
Just
Anyway,
look for the white light coming out
yeah.
of the under
Anyway, I
from the
was
door. Yeah.
surprised, but that's a
Yeah.
different world back then. Um, okay, so you took English, and you knew you wanted to be a writer.
Mhm.
Um, But you didn't start writing right after you got out of college, did you?
No, I did. I mean, I always wrote. I didn't publish. And
Oh,
when I was finishing college, this was the time when it was just you're sort of just transitioning from actual paper physical mail submissions where
mhm.
you send a copy of your essay to a magazine with a self-addressed stamped envelope, which was
Yeah.
a real barrier for me. Just a few years later everything went online and that made things much easier. But yeah, that was so I wrote, but I never sent anything in. I was in an essay contest once, a nonfiction essay contest that was judged by Peter Mathiasen judged my essay, and he wrote me a nice note. I didn't win, but he wrote me a nice note. It
Oh,
said,
that's nice.
"A contender," and that was basically the only thing that I submitted to, I think, for the first probably 3 or 4 years after graduating.
Did you I mean, I don't know, I'm gonna ask as a writer, I wrote a lot. Even though I mean, I did history as well as before I did science,
Mm.
so but, I wrote and I didn't publish, but in graduate school I wrote, and I always found and I still do this. I write something when I get angry or passionate. I mean, if I do it often just so I can get it off my mind,
Mm.
even if I don't submit it.
Mhm.
Does it do you do does that impact
Every once in a while. No, if I'm angry about something, I usually just complain to my wife.
Yeah, 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 no, but I find I need to do it to focus on other things. If I
Yeah.
just get it out, and I used to submit when I was all the time to the op-ed page in the New York Times, and it was very
Mhm.
frustrating, of course, because they never published it.
Yeah.
But I did see my even though they say there's a barrier between the op-ed page and the columnists, I
Right.
2 or 3 times I saw my title in a columnist, line. Anyway, I don't know,
Yeah, I've
but
had that
it
experience as well.
it took a long time later. I'm not gonna talk about my writing time, but okay, but eventually it was, and we'll get to this, it was only when you were, like, 30 that you decided you wanted to be a journalist, right?
Yeah, so I
After a long and winding road of
Yeah.
drinking.
Right, yeah, so after college, I moved to Portland from North Carolina right after college,
Mhm,
and I worked in coffee shops, I did some unpaid internships, I sat at bars and did crossword puzzles and
mm.
and screwed around, I sort of lived in it was a good time to be in Portland at the this was in
Portland,
the
a lot of craft beer. I lived in
Yes.
Portland, as you know, so
Yes. So I wasn't into the craft beer, I just wanted PBR. This was in the early 2000s, and it was a good time to be in Portland. It was still inexpensive. You could work part-time and still live right in the city
Mhm,
and drink full-time and still live in the city, and so I did that for a few years, and then I moved back to North Carolina, continued to do that just in different locations, and then, I started to kinda get my shit together professionally
mhm.
when I was 30, so 29, 30. It took a while. And
Oh
I went to grad school too, but I
oh, you
dropped
did go
out.
to grad school. In what?
Yeah.
Writing or
No, I did it like a year or maybe less of information science at Chapel Hill. Um,
information science,
I
computer
don't
you
know
like
what the yeah, it was like in the School of Library and Information Science. I
yeah.
skipped orientation, so I never figured out quite what it was. Um, and some of it was tech heavy, sort of database management, systems
And you
analysis.
taught you'd already gotten in, I mean, that intrigued you? Why?
No, it didn't at all. My sister had gotten her master's in library science from the
Oh,
program, and it was easy to get into. And I was living in Chapel Hill at that point, and I
uh,
needed to do something. And so I did that. And also because when you get a student loan, they give you a big refund check so that you
oh.
can live on that for a while. So I wanted to live on poor financial planning. So I wanted to live on what felt like free money at the time. It was not free money,
Yeah,
but
I know.
yeah, I didn't
Okay.
last.
And, so when did you get married? What age?
Let's see. I've been married for it was way later. It was
You got married after this, after you decided
I
after
got married in 2020.
Oh, okay, okay.
Okay.
And did you
So
meet Jana I mean, were you together for a while before that or no?
no, I met her so I moved back to North Carolina from Portland. Then I left again. I moved to various different cities, sort of bopped around North Carolina. Um, I was living in Durham and I decided I wanted to start working as a journalist. I wanted to try to get into
Mm.
journalism. And the reason for this, I've always been motivated by pettiness. And the reason for this was at the time I had been dating a journalist
No.
a radio journalist, and she broke up with me, and I was like, "I am going to take your job." And and I did.
Oh,
No,
Jesus.
I did not literally take her job,
Yeah.
but I did wanna get into journalism, and she had sort of none of the like, she hadn't gone to college, she just sort of worked her way
Yeah.
up, and that was also sort of eye-opening that you did not have to have a degree in journalism. So, I was motivated by spite. Um,
But did your relationship with her help you get interested in journalism?
I had been interested in it before,
Uh-huh.
and so but I met her. She broke then, we dated for a while, she broke up
Yeah.
with me, and then it was sort of like, "Okay, this is the motivation to kind of get my life together in this sense," I was
Uh-huh.
very depressed about it, and I needed something to sort of push me forward, and I thought, "Okay, I'm gonna get an internship," and I got an internship at the local public radio station. Actually, the show I was working for was a Canadian show. It was out of UNC Chapel Hill, but the guy who, the host was a Canadian named Dick Gordon. This show was called The
Mm.
Story with Dick Gordon. It was syndicated all over the country.
Uh-huh.
So I interned with The Story for a while, and then after that, I got my first job, in journalism at a public radio station
So
in
you started in
Charlotte.
radio before you went to print.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And
Yeah.
then, I want okay. And then you went to print, you moved to Portland and
Seattle.
you moved back to Portland. So
Well,
we're
I
at
moved
Portland. Sorry, go
Portland
on.
to North Carolina to Portland to North Carolina to Seattle.
To Seattle. That's right. Seattle is where you wrote that. That's
Yeah.
was that Seattle Journal. I wrote down a note here that I thought that your desire to be a journalist was related to your drinking.
No.
Because I got that sense from reading the book somewhere that you were basically at some low point and you said, "Well, I've got to have a career. I got to be a journalist." But
I mean, it was I guess it sort of indirectly was related to my drinking. I mean, it was direct I wanted to be a journalist. I had always been a public radio mega fan, so I grew up
uh
and I was one of what they call a backseat baby, a kid who
yeah,
sort of grows up
yeah.
with NPR on the radio.
Well, you
And
mentioned they like car talk, which I
yeah,
love, by the way, but you
yeah,
didn't like it.
yeah.
Okay, sorry. Anyway, go
And
on.
so NPR was the public radio was sort of the most common media in my family. You couldn't get the New York Times delivered to our town. The
Ah,
local paper only came out once a week. We got magazines and stuff, but radio was the thing that was always there. I loved radio. I said before I wanted to be David Sedaris. I first encountered David Sedaris on his essays on This American Life.
uh-huh,
So but I never thought I could do it. I didn't go to a good college. I wasn't a great student. I didn't have any experience. I didn't know how
uh,
it worked. And at this low point, when I was in my late 20s, when I had been dumped by this broadcast
mm,
journalist, I thought like, okay, well, fuck you. If you can do it, I can do it.
mhm.
So that was the thing that sort of changed everything for
Oh,
me
okay,
was
okay.
have, and I was motivated by spite, but also whatever whatever
Y
works. But that
yeah,
was the
whatever.
thing that sort of prompted me. I had at the time I was working at a publishing house and it was a fine job, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. I was editing and things like that. I had
Oh,
to
that's intriguing. I've seen so
hmm
many I've written a lot of books and I've met a lot of the junior people in publishing houses, and
yeah.
they're all the same. They all wanna write. They work in
Yes.
a publishing house. They
Exactly. That was
yeah,
exactly what it was.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so radio was my way to get into journalism.
Okay. And then, well, this may then be the next question may be natural then, because I was wondering what led you to podcasting. Was that because you sort of missed the radio part of your I mean, now you become a writer
Yeah.
and you missed it. Why the pod what got you into the podcast? You and Jesse Single, what blocked and reported, which is you've both been canceled at different times, and it's about
Mhm.
I read somewhere that was about internet nonsense. I
Mhm.
like the fact, by the way, that this week's episode, or at least I don't know whether it's week's episode, but the episode that just appeared on my email today was "Weird Science of Gender,"
Mhm.
which is something that we were talking about
Yeah.
at the beginning.
So so yeah, so I started out in radio, then I moved I got a job at the public radio station in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I worked there for a year, and I really didn't like Charlotte. Charlotte's a sort of a boring I don't probably didn't give it a fair shake, but at the time I thought of it as a very boring banking town. And so I was
Mhm.
looking for other jobs, and a job came up in Seattle at an environmental magazine called Grist. So it's all online. And Grist, the ethos of the magazine at the time was like, we're going to be like, this is about climate change, this is about the environment, but also it's funny. And so that really appealed to me. And so I applied
Hmm.
for a job there. I got the job. I moved out to Seattle. And so that's how I first got, that was my first print job or text job. It wasn't actually in print because it was all online.
Hmm.
And so I worked there for a couple years. And the thing about radio, I don't, people, and podcasting is the same way. It depends on the style of podcast, but the way that if you hear, like, if you're listening to like This American Life or Radiolab or a show like that, not a talk show as much like
Yeah,
this, but these really highly produced shows, there is a massive amount of writing that goes into that, and
sure.
it's a
I've
different
been on it.
form of writing. But Jan Abermont, or he's retired now, but whoever's hosting Radiolab, will have a script in front of them. They are reading from a script. Not the whole
Hmm.
thing. There's banter and ad lib and things like that, but a lot of it is writing. And I like that about it, but it's also much harder than print, just in terms of, like, to make 5 minutes of really good radio can take hours. Of course, there's a vast spectrum. You have Joe Rogan or just the conversation that we're having now. This is very casual. There's no
Hmm.
writing involved. There's no scripting. But for these highly produced shows, there's a ton of writing, a ton of production. It's just a massive amount of labor. Print, you just fucking write. And so when I moved to print, it felt really easy. There's still research involved, there's still craft involved, but it just, the amount of labor involved is much lower. And so that's when I got that job, I thought, like, why would I ever go back into producing podcasts or radio? It's so hard compared to just saying what I want, editing it, and posting it. That's
Hmm.
like, you take out all of the sort of I don't know, the manual labor of it. Um, and then so I got laid off at Grist. I went and I got a job at The Stranger, this outlet in Seattle. One of the first public pieces that they published was this article on detransitioners, and there was this massive backlash, and people were burning stacks of the paper and sending me video up, just a truly unhinged backlash. And my bosses at The Stranger were impressed with the way that I handled it because I refused to apologize. There were many demands that I apologize, and I just wouldn't
I'm
do it because I hadn't
all
done
in
anything
favor of
wrong.
that.
I had
Hmm.
to go through this sort of struggle session with members, self-appointed leaders from Seattle's trans community, all trans women, so all male, sort of snapping in my face and telling me I was going to get trans people killed, and I just refused to see, I just refused to admit that I was wrong because I wasn't wrong. And The Stranger, it's been around for well over 30 years at this point, closer to 40. The founders were the people who founded The Onion. They're
Oh,
very Gen X. They
yeah,
appreciated that ethos. The younger staff members did not appreciate it, but the
yeah.
leadership did. And so when I wrote that piece on detransitioners, I'd been a freelancer, but that piece got me a staff job.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So I went and I worked there for a couple years. Then COVID happened, and I got laid off from the paper, and which I was glad about. And then Jesse and I was doing some freelance writing, but Jesse and I started the podcast, and the
I
timing
want
was
to know
right.
why. I mean, you started the podcast, but what caused you to want to do a podcast? That was the question I had.
Well, I think we just thought it would be fun, and we had been talking about it for several months, and we started talking about it before COVID. We were in
What
a
got you
group.
together? Was it writing or your mutual interests or what?
Yeah, mutual interest. So Jesse had written on trans issues in a way that almost nobody was doing at the time.
Yeah.
So I had reached out to him when I was working on my piece on detransitioners in 2017,
uh, uh,
and I wanted to interview him for the article, and he said no because he's competitive and he thought I was going to scoop him, which I did by a year. And so that's how we met. We became sort of internet friends. We met in person for the first time at the first Heterodox Academy conference. So this was in 2018 in New
Wow.
York.
Hmm.
And Jesse, this was right before his cover story on detransitioners was to come out in the Atlantic. I think the last day of the conference, it was a Sunday. His article was coming out on the Monday. And I asked him, I had been through this experience a year before. I'd gotten canceled, this huge stockpile, and I asked him if he was nervous. And he said no. He was like, it's been fact checked. It's so thorough. I spent so much time with it. Nothing's going to happen. And I thought, this man's an idiot. I'll go into business with him. And then, a few years later, we started the podcast. So that's how Jesse and I met. He was, of course, very wrong about the
Yeah.
reaction to his
Yeah.
article.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
And then and you met and you just wanted to talk about is it really about internet nonsense? Is there a theme?
That is the theme, but it's sort of hard to describe.
Hmm.
When I meet people who have never heard of the show or who aren't super online, I say it's criticism. It's media criticism, it's political criticism, it's cultural criticism, all of which is true. But we have over time, so we started the show in 2020, and at the time we were talking a lot about Black Lives Matter, COVID, the things that were happening in the culture at that moment. And over time, it's evolved. And Jesse and I, we don't have meetings. We barely have a calendar. Like we have no business running a business together. But the show just sort of naturally evolved to these stories that other people weren't covering. So we talk a lot about these niche internet communities that we're not even a part of, just because we find them
Mm.
fascinating.
Okay.
And the show for the first 4 years was a lot about sort of liberal infighting and progressive meltdowns. So
Hmm.
lots like our audience tends to love shows about like an anarchist coffee shop in Philadelphia that's run by furries, and then the employees try to unionize and the whole thing goes bust. So we've done a lot of stories like that. The Trump administration has certainly changed things because at the time that we started the show, progressives had undeniable cultural and political power. Even it was
Hmm.
2020, Trump was in
Yeah.
office, but
Yeah.
the zeitgeist was very progressive,
Yeah.
and that has changed in a way that I think if we were still exclusively doing sort of like anarchist, which I love the anarchist cafe shows,
Yeah.
but if
Yeah.
that's just what we were doing, I don't think it would be an accurate reflection of the world, because a lot of the show is about free speech and cancel culture. And no matter how bad you think leftists were on those issues, and I do think many leftists were quite bad on those issues
Mm.
over the period of the awakening, the Trump administration is worse.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we should have. Okay. I keep wondering why you haven't had me on from the War on Science book, but
We'll
we
have to
can
have
have
you
a
on.
conversation about that because there's two big attacks on science, and they're very different. And
Mhm.
one is worse in one way, and one is worse in the other. I think
Yeah.
my own feeling is that the what you might call I don't like to label left and right, but what you might call
Yeah.
the 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 the, the woke attack on science, I
Yeah.
think is worse in the sense it's much going to be much harder to get rid of
Mm. Mm.
in the long run. And I think that's because it's ingrained in such way. Okay, well, we've gone on for a long time. Don't you think it's time we try to talk about
Sure.
your book? Which is, I
Yeah.
mean, I think it's important. I thought it was important before I read it. Also, I knew I wanted to get to know you better, and so I thought, oh, this should be in this book. And um, it's Drink Your Way Sober, the science-based method to break free from alcohol. But Drink Your Way Sober is such an interesting idea, and so counterintuitive. And we'll talk about the
Mhm.
counterintuitiveness of it that I wanted to read it, and I have read it in great depth, and I only have, it turns out, 70 questions for you. So we'll see. We should be done by tonight.
All right,
But
sounds
anyway, the
good. So
conventional wisdom has always been, as you pointed out at the
mhm.
beginning of the book, that alcoholism is once an alcoholic, you're always an alcoholic, and the only way to go is abstinence. And as you point out in the first part of your introduction to the book, that's wrong. In fact, the first page of your introduction, that's wrong. Um, and what I was really pleased with, since I'm a scientist, is you immediately say science actually has accomplished what once seemed impossible, as if that's a strange thing. But that's what the science is all about. It's really a wonderful aspect. But it basically has a cure, you would say, and that is totally goes against the grain of anything in popular culture right now. And I think
Mhm.
um, um, but the weird thing about this cure is that, as you point out, is it requires you, in general, to drink,
Right.
and that therein lies the rub. That
Right.
you're being cured from something that's supposed to be bad by doing it, and that, as we'll talk about, affects a lot of people's reactions to it and doctors' reactions to it, and and uh, and so that that's the introduction, and it involves a drug called naltrexone, which we'll talk about in depth. But it's a drug that you take um, before you drink, and that will, in principle, changed your approach to drinking? And we'll talk in more detail. I want to let you talk about it, but that's what you clearly start. But let's start the book. Um, uh, you start the book at rock bottom, and you say you're in denial. Is that a common? I mean, I want to talk about alcoholism and alcoholics as well as the remarkable many features of the solutions and things you talk about here. But have you found among your fellow alcoholics that denial is the norm rather than the exception?
Denial tends to be a part of the journey, right? So you say I start the book at rock bottom. It's true, but I had a lot of rock bottoms, and I had periods of going through denial and periods that I wasn't in denial, and I had periods when I was drinking more and periods when I was drinking less. So it's really not, for me, it wasn't linear, the path in and out of alcoholism. But I do think, just thinking off of the top of my head, I know a lot of alcoholics. I would say that a lot of them, while they're drinking, are in denial, actively drinking. And then something happens that maybe they get to a crisis point and then all of a sudden they can't deny it anymore. But it's a very destabilizing realization to come to, because what I thought when I first came to that realization, what I thought was that if I'm an alcoholic, I have to quit drinking. That is the only way out of this. And if you have a drinking problem, if alcohol is the source of your problems, even if alcohol is the source of many of your problems, you probably have a love-hate relationship with it. And quitting that, giving up this thing that seems impossible, it seems like an impossibility. And it seems like I was under the impression that if I quit drinking, I would be left wanting for the rest of my life. I would spend the
Hmm.
rest of my life sort of battling my own nature.
Yeah, no, I mean that's the daunting part, and then one of the things you talk about is it that's probably what turns many people away from trying to get cured because it seems so impossible and seems so daunting and seems so uh, uh, cataclysmic, and the idea that you might be able to overcome it without actually ever having to go to that extreme it should be something that is talked about a lot more. We
Mhm.
Before we get to that, in fact, one of the things you point out is that we don't say we've used the term alcoholics, but that's now not
Right.
as now one rather use alcohol use disorder,
Yeah,
which
or,
because
you know,
alcoholic
person.
has a sort of moral tone about it, whereas alcohol
It
use disorder
does.
makes it sounds medical. You want to go into
Right,
that?
but it's just so much longer. So,
Yeah.
and you need to have a noun, so it has to be like person with alcohol use disorder, person with AUD, and I don't like that. I don't like the sort
Mm,
of euphemism treadmill. I think there
yeah.
are some valid reasons that clinicians in particular have shied away from the term alcoholism. Stigma, the the use of the word spectrum, it describe or the use of alcohol use disorder describes more accurately describes a spectrum, and there is a vast spectrum of
Yes.
problem drinking. That's true. It tends to be these days the only people who reliably use the term alcoholic are people in AA. It's still popular there, but most other institutions have moved away from that term, but I use it.
Yeah, no, it's key point you point out is that it allows the idea of a spectrum, and there's a whole spectrum which you talk about, and of course that spectrum implies a different, as you might imagine, if there's a spectrum of people, you might imagine different solutions for different people. It's not too,
Absolutely.
I mean, if you're thinking about this rationally, it's not surprising that different things work for different people. Um,
Right.
but one of the things you point out early in the book, I mean, is how vast a problem this is. I mean, I guess I never really thought of the numbers. I'll quote some of the numbers you give. 180,000 Americans die each year from excessive drinking. I mean, that's 178,000. Um,
Mhm.
that's that's more than I think. Well, of course, some of them die in car accidents and other things because they're
Right.
drunk driving. But I think that's more than the number that die in car accidents in general. Um,
I don't know about car accidents, but I do it absolutely dwarfs other drugs, except for tobacco.
Except for tobacco.
Tobacco, right, but
It's weird. You don't think of
fentanyl.
it as I mean, you don't put it in perspective. You know a lot of alcoholics, but you don't realize it's such 178,000 people. And
Right.
that's just a small percentage. Those are people that die, but there's also
Right.
many people, as you point out, that's a small fraction because they have disease,
Yes.
they have
Right.
physical, mental problems. And you listed someone in 2010, it was estimated that cost the economy about $250 billion a year in health,
Mhm.
productivity, justice, all sorts of cost to society, $250 billion, and that half the homicides that are reported are probably alcohol induced, and not surprisingly, one third to two thirds of sexual assaults. So,
Right.
given that, given that it's such an $250 billion, it's an epidemic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why
I think
isn't a
that's
lot
fair.
more money spent on a cure than there is? Do you,
Well, I mean, a lot of money has been spent on treatments,
treatments, but why
but
not more on a cure? Why not?
right. So that's a good question. I think the answer to that is three or fourfold. So one just comes back to the dominance of 12-step programs and AA in the culture. So AA has been around for, at this point, almost 100 years. It was founded in the 1930s, and AA had a basically really good marketing. There was one
Mm,
member in particular, one of the earliest women in the program. Her name was Marty Mann, and she was very well connected in media, in Hollywood, and AA saved her life, and she made it her mission in life to spread the gospel of AA, and she did. And so she got AA in Hollywood films, she got people talking about it, and over the years, it just became this hegemonic force, within the culture. And so when you go to a rehab program now, and this has changed a bit, but for a long time, if you go to rehabs, which can be incredibly expensive,
yeah.
often what you were getting, the care that you were getting was based on AA. It was based on these what are typically free programs. So that's part of it. Just the cultural dominance of AA has sort of edged other treatments out, and I don't think that's intentional. I think it's an organic process. And there have been one thing I learned when writing the book is that there have been many, many, many treatments throughout the history of humankind and our relationship with alcohol to address both sort of short-term withdrawals and chronic alcoholism. Um, and over the years, just as AA became more popular, everything else just got sort of edged out. So that's part of it. I also think the reason that pharmacological solutions, drugs, haven't been more explored or more considered acceptable in American culture is this sort of moralizing. We tend to think, there's people like to say that alcoholism is a disease. I think it's more complex than that. I don't think it's that. There's just more nuances there. But we still tend to treat it as though it is a moral failing, and we often think as a culture that moral problems need to have moral solutions. It has to be something there has to be something at the root of your alcoholism. There you have to atone for your sins. AA provides that in a way that drugs don't. So that's part of it. Medical education also in the United States has almost ignored addiction until
Yeah,
recent
well, we'll get
years.
to that later on. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, there's a change in
yeah.
medical education, but it is surprising given that. I mean, when I thought about it, I thought, um, just almost from a capitalist perspective, you would think
Mhm.
that if there's this huge disease and you can make, I
Right.
mean, just like diet now, and I mean, you can
Right.
just make all this money from people who have this problem. It is surprising, and we talk about there's more specific things, especially um, uh, related to naltrexone, about why it maybe has not caught more. We'll get to it, but it is a
Yeah.
surprising fact. Now, you did say you said in a way that there was a love hate relationship with drinking, and somewhere early in the book you say you start drinking to feel good, and I know that's why you started drinking. But in the end, you continue to drink because not drinking feels terrible. So
Yeah.
would you want to expand on your own experience there?
Yeah, so that's I think a pretty common experience, almost cliched, in the alcoholism world. Um, at the end of so I started drinking young. I was 12 or 13 when I had my first drink,
Wow.
and
Out of the house?
yeah, do what?
Wasn't in the house, was it?
It was at a friend's
Oh,
parents. We
yeah.
stole some alcohol stolen from a
Yeah.
from
Oh,
a
okay.
friend's
Yeah.
parents. I started going to keg parties when I was in high school. I drank a lot in college, and at the time, it was fun and it felt like freedom. I loved college. I didn't care that much about the education, but I loved the freedom that I
Yeah.
felt it afforded me. There was nothing I liked more than to sit on my porch at my first house, my first grown-up house out of, my sophomore year in
Yeah.
college and drink beer and read the New Yorker. I loved it. And that sense of freedom lasted for a long time, but at some point, alcohol started interfering with other aspects of my life, my relationships, my job, school, all of it. And it started to dominate my life and it started to dominate my thoughts. And it became it became almost it became an obsession, right? So for years, I went to school, I went to college, I saw my friends, I did whatever, I lived my life, but in the back of my mind, I was always thinking about drinking. I was always thinking about when I could drink, where I could drink, if I was gonna drink, also knowing that I needed to quit, but being unable to do it. So it was an obsession. And people now use the term food noise when they're talking about Ozempic, how Ozempic
Yeah.
quiets the food noise. I had booze noise, and it was nonstop for 20 years. Um, yeah, and it felt impossible. It felt like that this was never going to end. Like I would never live a life that was not consumed with alcohol.
It's interesting because that's end of the spectrum. One of the things you point out, which I didn't realize, is that 10% of the population is on this spectrum of alcohol use disorder. 10% is 30 million people or so, which is
Yeah, in the
huge.
US.
But
Yeah.
but um but also what I didn't realize is that 70% of them get better without intervention. So it
Yeah.
does indicate there's a huge spectrum
Oh,
of
absolutely. Yeah.
I didn't
So if
realize
I
that so many, you know.
Yeah, if I think back on my peers in college who I had my sort of early drinking days with, most of them graduated from college, went and got a job, or went to grad school, or moved to a new town, and they just gradually drank less. They got married, they had kids, and they found that alcohol wasn't compatible with their lives, and so they naturally drank less. They didn't have to go to AA, they didn't have to go to therapy, they didn't have to take medication. They just drank less. That's really common. It's just called natural recovery. And it's not something that's talked about that much, but it's most people's path. Most people who have a drinking problem do not end up having to go to AA or having to quit entirely. They just age out of drinking.
Yeah, that was news to me. I thought that was interesting. By the way, since you mentioned it, and maybe binge drinking or drinking in college or particularly drinking in high school, I mentioned to you that, well, we talked earlier about my experience when grew up in Canada, which was where drinking age was 18, and it was for a while in the U.S. I think too. And it's still, I think it's 18 or 19 still in Canada. But do you think that? I mean, one of the things occurred to me I've lived in Europe for a while, is that where kids drink at home and have
Mhm.
wine with dinner, is that part of the problem, and this is anecdotal, but you see kids who first of all, it's illegal, they're not allowed to, and therefore they want
Mhm.
to, and suddenly they have the opportunity to, and it's like,
Right.
wow, I'm gonna drink to excess, and
Right.
and
Right.
a lot of kids get sick and get overcome it, but I can't help but think that making it so taboo, or at
Yeah.
least, and so what do you think about this fact that it's 21? You can vote,
Right.
you can go to war, but you can't
Right.
drink. I mean, it just seemed crazy to me.
Yeah. I think there is something to that. I think the prohibition of it the taboo makes it more exciting. I would be really I'm sure that countries like France also have significant over drinking problems. I would be
Yeah,
interested in sort of seeing the statistics about binge drinking in college. Do French students actually drink less in college because they are sort of trained from a young age? I'm sure not all of them, but some of them
yeah.
trained from a young age to sort of drink responsibly.
Yeah, no, it'd be interesting. I'm sure the studies have been done.
Mhm.
But talking about drinking, and you were probably in the top 10%. You said the top 10% of alcoholics or drinkers drink over 50% alcohol, and they drink over 74 drinks a week. Was that
Mhm.
you?
Yes, at different times, yes.
Yeah, it's amazing to think. And we'll talk about how you got down from 74 drinks a week. It just seems, yeah, wow. But
Mhm.
now I want to go back. You talked about the history, and one of my questions was about Ms. Mann, but it is interesting to go back. I was surprised at how far back the records are for alcohol and alcohol maybe consumption. You want to go back to where it began?
Yeah. So the earliest traces of human consumption of alcohol are about 9,000 years old in China. It's probably some variation of rice wine. But of course, just because, one shard of pottery has traces of rice wine that's 9,000 years old doesn't mean that people weren't drinking from really much earlier.
Yeah,
Even there's some animals that will eat fermented fruits.
yeah.
There's a famous moose in Alaska that would eat fermented apples and get wasted on that and sort of terrorize an Alaskan town. So it would not surprise me if there's something something innate about the human and possibly the animal condition. That not all animals for sure, not all people to be sure,
Well,
but that
cats
the
do like
history might be much longer.
cats do like catnip.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and but then when I was reading the book, I wrote a note of I think the first time there was a treat that recognized as a, well, maybe not the first time, but you mentioned it, that they're sort of talked about as a treatment or a disease, was 1784. Is that
Yeah.
you want to talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, so there's a founding father named Benjamin Rush, who not as famous as as Franklin or Washington or
Yeah.
Jefferson, but one of our founding fathers down here in the states. He was a physician, and he was one of the earliest people to describe chronic drinking as a disease. I don't remember the exact language that he used. He had some very floral terms for it, or florid terms for it. And he started what would evolve into what were called sanatoriums. So places for people basically to go dry out. And so these were less about treating the chronic condition, but just people who were acutely drunk, who were going through withdrawals, what would later become sort of drunk tanks.
Mhm. And that was, yeah, I didn't realize it was that early, that it was sort of thought of as a disease rather than just some
Hmm.
kind of moral condition. When did AA begin? How old is it?
So 1930s, that was the first.
1930s is when it began.
Yeah, and there were temperance societies before AA. There was one called the Washingtonians. There were different groups that had this sort of peer support or temperance mission. But AA was the first one that was really successful.
Yeah, and Marty Mann made it more successful, and it's now, yeah,
Hmm.
everywhere. It's what you hear about, what you
Right,
see everywhere, and I think it's hard to know someone who hasn't been. I think
right.
I don't know. With my experience is typical. I know many people who've been,
Yeah.
but okay. So there's that experience is the 12 steps. The complete abstinence, the support groups, and the religious overtones, which is always gave me queasy bits, being a well-known atheist, I guess. But I guess I was willing to. We'll talk about this later a little bit. But for me, I was willing, like I just suspend disbelief in science fiction. My feeling was, okay, I don't care about the religious bits if it helps. Just like, I didn't care about telling my daughter there was Santa Claus for a while.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right.
but in any case, so that created what is now the paradigm, which is it's an
Mhm.
incurable disease. You're a lifetime alcoholic, and the only way is to constantly be reinforced in not drinking with a support group and never to drink, because the minute you
Yeah,
touch alcohol again, you're doomed.
yeah.
Then you have
So
John David Sinclair. You want to
mhm.
talk about him and how he
Sure. So let me
discovered what
so
he did?
there's this yes, but before we get to that, so I think there's a bit of a misconception about what AA actually says and what sort
Mhm.
of our popular conception of what AA says. So AA, the one of the founders, his name, Bill Wilson, I forgot it for a
Mhm.
second. Bill Wilson was an incredibly open-minded man, and
Mhm.
so he was very aware. Like he was doing LSD in the 1950s with Timothy Leary. This is very controversial within AA,
Uh,
but he was aware that that AA was not the only way to get sober. He was aware that some people could moderate their drinking, just not people like him. He was aware. He was the person who wrote, someday science may discover a cure for
yeah.
alcoholism, but it hasn't yet. So he was open minded, but and that's all in the big book. You can read that for yourself in the big book, which is the sort of the central text of AA. But that message has gotten lost. And so before I read the big book, even when I went to plenty of AA meetings when I was younger, but before I read the big book, I thought, okay, so this is what AA says. There's only one way to get sober, and that's through AA. AA itself never says that. That message persists, but it's not original to AA.
Mhm.
Okay, so John David Sinclair, so he was an American researcher. He did his PhD at Oregon. He's originally did his undergraduate work in Cincinnati, I believe, and then after he finished his PhD, he moved to Finland, to Helsinki, and he got a job at a researcher at what at the time was called Alco Laboratories. And so this was a state funded lab funded by alcohol taxes at the time. Finland, the state had basically a monopoly on their alcohol
Mhm.
supply. So in the same building, they had alcohol distributors. They also had people working to find solutions to the problems that alcohol caused. And so John David Sinclair, he had done his PhD on this, and he went there and he started. Actually, this was when he was working on his PhD, and even before he started doing studies on lab rats, and he realized a couple of important things. And so one of those was later he named it the alcohol deprivation effect. But to describe it, there's this idea that if you abstain from alcohol for a long time, then your cravings will diminish. That's not, for most people, that's not actually how it works. Rather, if you abstain from alcohol, your cravings go stronger. Not for everybody. Of course, everybody's
Hmm.
different. If you haven't had a drink for 30 years, you probably aren't going to get any cravings for them. But let's say you're doing something like a dry January and you go through this 30 days without drinking. What do a lot of people do on February 1st? They binge.
Hmm.
And that was my experience, right? And so I would have periods of sobriety throughout my life, but they never stuck. At some point there was going to be some craving that was so strong that I was going to give into it. And I just couldn't get past that. And so John David Sinclair, so he realized this and he thought, what if there was a way to diminish the desire for alcohol itself? Because we have all these people, they know they need to quit drinking, they know it's ruining their lives, but they cannot stop because they continue to want to drink. And so he tried various experiments, basically. And at one point, he gave his lab rats that had been they had been bred to like alcohol. Rats aren't naturally big drinkers, but these ones had been. And so he gave them various drugs and he to see what would happen. And one of these was an opioid blocker called naltrexone. And when he gave the lab rats naltrexone and then gave them access to alcohol, they would drink less. So that was key. He wasn't giving them access to alcohol and then forcing them to abstain.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was, although he did that as well. But it was that combination, alcohol or naltrexone, the opioid blocker, plus alcohol, that he saw in studies lowered their desire to drink, lowered their consumption. And then he repeated this with humans and saw similar results.
So, and he discovered that by just trying different drugs. And I mean, I assume he would have thought that. I mean, if it's he was thinking behavioral science, that he would think, well, what can reduce the reward a little bit? What can
Right.
reduce but then, as you point out, we'll talk about it more later, in the fourth or fifth or sixth hour. No, I'm just joking. That there's this question, and I think it's still I I guess it's an unanswered question. One version seems eminently more sensible to me, but whether naltrexone reduces cravings or just reduces the rewards, and I guess
Yeah.
there's still a debate, an open debate among scientists on
Yes.
which it does.
Yeah, so I would say the foremost researcher who's also a clinician working on this is Joe Volpicelli.
Hmm.
He's outside of Philadelphia. He's fantastic. He was immensely helpful to me when I was working on the book. He wrote the foreword for the book. And Joe and John David Sinclair had this sort of friendly debate because Joe thought that naltrexone worked by preventing cravings.
Yeah.
And he was also his studies. Now, naltrexone has been FDA approved to treat alcohol use disorder for over 30 years, and it was his studies, along with a woman named Stephanie O'Malley from Yale, that were used to get the FDA approval for naltrexone. So they had this friendly debate. It remains an unsolved question. Basically, John David Sinclair, he thought it was this process of extinction, pharmacological extinction, and Joe thought there was a more direct path. It just diminishes the cravings. And honestly, who knows if that question will ever be answered? I think for most people, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I have to say, well, as my intuitive version, based on everything I've read in the book and the way it's used, is that it reduces the rewards and therefore reduces not so much the cravings. But in any case, who knows? But it was naltrexone was actually discovered way before that, 1963.
Yeah. Yeah.
You remind us where and how again?
Yeah, so it was first synthesized in the early 60s by a small chemical, like family run chemical company called,
Mhm.
I think it was Elko Laboratories. And then they were bought by DuPont. So DuPont had the early patent. And DuPont first started marketing it. So it's an opioid blocker.
Yeah.
And DuPont first started marketing it as a treatment for opioid addiction, for heroin, for
Yeah.
morphine, things like that. And so that was the first marketing. It was FDA approved for opioid use disorder, I think 1984, and then 10 years later for alcohol. And I talked to a drug rep who had been at DuPont at the time, and he said that he was so excited. He thought that this was the solution to the problem of morphine addiction or heroin addiction, because unlike drugs like methadone, it's not psychoactive, right? So you take the drug and you don't get the pleasurable effect of the drug itself, whether
Yeah.
that's alcohol or whether that's an opioid. And so one of the problems with methadone, which had cornered the market at the time,
Hmm.
was that you can't, like, naltrexone tended what he found was that naltrexone tended to work really well for highly motivated populations and professionals. So like pilots, doctors, nurses, people who can't take some, go get their methadone and then put a plane in the sky. And so naltrexone, because it doesn't have any psychoactive effects, it was less disruptive to one's professional path. And one thing that is helpful when it comes to recovery from drug and alcohol abuse is stability, having a job, maintaining your career. And so Percy was very hopeful, but he said that methadone had just kind of cornered the market, and drug and doctors weren't interested. It also remains true, and this is something Joe Lopicelli told me. DuPont's a chemical company, and so DuPont just was not sort of well positioned to market a drug. It's possible if another company had bought Elko Laboratories, if Pfizer had bought them or
Yeah.
whatever,
They would
there
have.
would have been much more success with naltrexone.
Interesting. Um, I thought, who produces methadone?
I don't know. I'm sure it's generic by now.
Oh, okay, but I thought DuPont had actually had a conflict of interest because they were involved in methadone too, and they didn't want to push one. I thought I remember that in your book. Maybe I'm wrong. That they didn't want to push naltrexone when they had a moneymaker like methadone.
Well, it's not
Um,
in my book. It's possible, but it's not in my book.
oh,
I'd have to
okay,
fact
okay,
check
maybe
that.
I'm really reading. But also, there was some resistance. Well, you make it also indirectly. It suggests that, look, the treatment industry is huge and very lucrative, and there are
Yes.
many treatments. And you point out that treatments are $28,000, $30,000, Betty
Yes.
Ford, etc., and that there was probably some resistance
Yeah.
from those as well.
Yeah, and I think that's organic rather than a conspiracy. I should say that these programs like Hazelden Betty Ford, so the biggest rehab conglomerate in the U.S., they've shifted their thinking on this, so they will prescribe medications for addiction now. But those programs tend to be staffed by people who have gone through recovery themselves. And so if you've gone through, and this is my experience, I went to outpatient therapy, I did or not inpatient, I did one-on-one therapy, group therapy, I went to AA, I did those sort of conventional
Yeah.
programs.
Yeah.
And the people who tend to work at them are people who got sober through rehab and AA. And so it's not so when I say it's not a conspiracy, that's what I mean. Like, they're just telling you what worked for them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, that's a good point to make, and I'm glad you made it. I want to make it clear. Yeah, they're not saying, "Oh, let's stop this," because this
Right.
worked for
But,
the
but I
idea is that this worked for
right.
us, and therefore it's the way we would think it should work. Yeah,
Right, but I also think there is there's a moral aspect to this too. A lot of people think, and since I published the book, I've gotten this feedback that the root of addiction is something else. The root of addiction cannot
yeah,
just be that you enjoy drinking and you drank too much and you got addicted, which I think is true in my case. The root of addiction has to be some sort of hole inside you, and you have to address the root cause, whether that's trauma or depression or anxiety or whatever. And if you don't address the root cause, you're a dry drunk, right? You might not be
yeah.
drinking, but you haven't solved the problem
Yeah,
itself.
that's an important. Yeah, we'll talk about that because you do talk about that. It's really important, and I think it's really it's related to the initial point you made. I mean, which is that it's a spectrum. It's not too
Right.
surprising that not everyone falls in the same into the same little box, and so
Right.
there are root causes for a lot of people, but there may not be. Well, we'll talk about some of the. There's a cause that may be genetic too. We'll talk about that. Um, this is an aside, but I was intrigued by it. I always thought of blacking. I want to jump back and forth, probably because you do in your book, between sort of the history and the science and what needs to be
Mhm.
done, and the experience of an alcoholic, and which you describe. And I I was talking to my friend of mine who just the other day who blacked out, and I always thought blacking out was just like becoming unconscious, but it's not. When you drink, the blacking out is a very different experience. You want to just talk about that for a second?
Yeah, so there's passing out, which
Mm.
is kind of what it sounds like,
Yeah,
you basically have heavy sleep.
yeah,
And then there's blacking out. So when you are blackout, and my friend Sarah Hepler wrote a book, a memoir called Blackout,
yeah.
um, that I recommend for people who are interested in this particular phenomenon. But blacking out is basically a form of amnesia. So
Hmm.
you appear completely conscious. You can have conversations, go order more drinks at the bar, go sing karaoke, drive, whatever, but you have no memory of it the next day.
Yeah. Wow. It's an amazing, amazing and scary phenomenon. You'd think, actually, for my friend, it was an experience of blacking out that basically changed the way. I mean, she was very young, and that's what stopped her from excessive drinking. But it must be,
Yeah.
but you did it often, and somehow it didn't scare you off.
No, and I think it was, in some ways, like if you have no memory of the night before, a rational person would say, okay, that's a really big problem. I need to stop this. To me, it was almost like my brain protecting me from whatever embarrassing thing I had
Mm.
done,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if anything happened. It seems fine. I don't have any memory of whatever embarrassing thing I did last night.
And other than a bike accident, I guess, um, I suppose you're fortunate. I mean, it could have been a lot worse, right? You could have,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, and you
I was
talked
never
about some people
arrested.
waking up in various
Right.
places.
Right. I was never in a car accident. I was never arrested. I had, sort of small traumas and things like that, but nothing major. The fact that I'm alive and have a job and I'm married and, I pay my taxes on time is sort of a miracle,
Yeah,
considering what I did to my body, but
yeah. I mean,
I got
I was the
lucky.
first. You know what? I have to say, the first thing I did when I looked at you is thought, well, you seem pretty healthy for someone who did all that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, it's really amazing.
I'm very lucky, yeah.
It's amazing. Now, you found the Sinclair method from a article by Gabrielle Glover, I guess. Wow,
Glasser.
but the in the Atlantic. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so this piece was published in 2015 and it was called The Irrationality of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was mostly a critique of AA. But she had a section in the piece about John David Sinclair and the Sinclair method. And she actually went to Finland. He died in, I believe, actually 2015, but she went to Finland and she met him and went to a clinic in Finland where the primary mode of treatment was the Sinclair method. And when I read that, I just thought, okay, this is the solution to my problem because it allowed you to continue to drink. And that was the problem. I knew I needed to quit drinking. I wanted to quit drinking, sort of, but I also didn't want to
Wanted to
quit
drink.
drinking.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what always had been my great struggle with abstinence is I just didn't want to stop even though I knew I needed to. And so this seemed like the perfect solution. And so I went and I got a prescription for naltrexone and stopped, picked it up at the pharmacy, stopped at a corner store and got a big beer on my way home, took the pill, waited an hour, which is how long it takes to metabolize. And I just felt awful. I had really bad side effects the first time I took the pill. And so I was really disappointed. I thought like, all right, this isn't it. I felt my stomach hurt, my head hurt. I felt depressed, just nauseous. I just really felt bad. And I thought, okay, I can't do this. This is not gonna be the miracle cure for me. And so I just stowed my medication away and I continued to drink for the next few years until COVID. And then COVID sort of my drinking accelerated to the point where it was obscuring every other thing in my life. And I tried again and it worked.
And you point out, and we'll talk about this again, maybe. Uh, that yeah, there are side effects, but side effects, of course, like anything, are different. You happen to have
Yeah.
been particularly sensitive. Some people have more
Yeah.
side effects, some people have less. And the other thing, and it's later on, but I guess the more as you took it, your side effects waned,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, they're manageable. There's also so typical most people do not seem to have side effects from this medication. People who do tend to have a little bit of nausea, a little bit of headache, and kind of can make you tired. I don't think it makes anybody feel good. It's an endorphin blocker,
Yeah.
you
So
know.
again,
Right,
the whole
right.
point is not to feel good.
Right, that's the point. But if you do it in this very targeted way, like don't take naltrexone and go for a run. That's
Yeah.
gonna it's don't do that. But if you do it in this very targeted way, the idea is that it just targets the behavior, the problematic behavior itself, which in this case is drinking. There's some indication that it can also work for things like gambling, cocaine, not cannabis. Cannabis works on a different system. Um, but yeah, it to me, it was just sort of the side of when I eventually did sort of commit full time to doing this during COVID, the side effects, I spent time learning how to manage side effects. I started with a low dose and titrated my way up. Some people take over the counter anti nausea medication or Zofran. Some people have no side effects at all, and so it's not an issue. And I just sort of reminded myself, like, okay, well, this isn't extreme, this isn't pleasant, but my life isn't pleasant right now, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna die if I continue to drink like this.
Yeah, that's I think we wanna get that point. At some point, it's a set of options. By the way, I
Right.
have to say, you hit me earlier, and I meant to say it. It's fascinating to me that Sinclair was in Finland, 'cause
Mhm.
I've been to Finland, numerous times, for physics, and I was never struck more by alcoholism than I was when I first visited to Finland. I'd
Interesting.
never seen more extreme versions of alcoholism on the street. Just
Ah,
in the summertime, walking
ah,
down the street, see people urinating on the street.
mhm.
Women, again, you tend to see more male
Yeah.
alcoholics, and just I remember seeing a woman, and I was really afraid for her health because she was totally, I was afraid for what would happen to her. So I walked her home, um, uh, it's extreme, and they have and as a result, they also have extreme penalties. If you, at least when I was there the first time, if you were caught driving drunk, you lost your license for life,
Oh,
life,
wow.
life.
Wow.
But and interestingly enough, by the way, I mean, it was a great place for him to test, to be
Yeah.
thinking about alcoholism. The other thing that's interesting is most of the alcoholism and the suicides occurring during the summer.
I'm not surprised by that,
Are
yeah.
you not surprised? Because it surprised me until
Yeah,
I thought about it, and the idea was that, well, if you have a long winter, when the
right.
summer comes, you should be feeling happy, but if you're not feeling happy, you feel even less happy.
Right, or there's also, I think, for, um you and I live at, probably about the same latitude, and
Yeah,
after a long, dark winter, people tend to go a little bit
yeah,
nuts
a
in the
little
summer.
bit crazy, yeah, it was
Yeah.
amazing to see it in the summer. I've been both times, but yeah. So, when we start talking about why, about why it isn't, used more or prescribed more, and why people don't use it, and there are a bunch of reasons, but one that surprised me, it's probably an American reason, because other countries don't behave this way. But someone told me they didn't want to get prescriptions, because if you get prescriptions for an opioid blocker, it goes in your record, and insurance companies, if you have a previous kind of condition, won't insure
Yeah.
you. And so that's
Yeah,
a
so
reason
that's
not
with
to be. You want to talk about it?
life insurance. So, as of now, because of Obamacare,
Yeah.
insurance this might change, but insurance companies are not allowed to deny people coverage based on pre-existing conditions. That's only been the law in the US for the last, what, 10 years. But life insurance companies can refuse your care. And I just got life insurance, and my life insurance was way more expensive than it
Because
should have been for a healthy 42-year-old because I
uh,
have naltrexone on my permanent record.
interesting. Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay. Now let's talk. Now, there's a bunch of times when I want to go back to science, which of course interests me a lot,
Yeah.
and that is, the first thing is that they're clearly, well, what he discovered in the rats, just by being able
Mhm.
to train rats, or not train, but being able to breed rats who would become alcoholics, that immediately
Yeah.
tells you there's a genetic component to alcoholism. But the
Yeah.
point is that it's not, I mean, as anyone should know, when we say there's a genetic component to anything,
Right.
it doesn't determine the future.
Right. Right.
It's not yeah, it's not the same as, it doesn't fix things
Right.
completely. Genetics is a component, and it
Right.
doesn't and so it's only one component of what makes you alcoholic, but probably half of the risk factors are
Yeah.
genetic, the other half are sort of, exposure. You wanna
Yeah,
go with that?
exposure, environment, a big risk factor is just peer group. Um, yeah, if someone has all of the genetic profile for an alcoholic and they never drink, they're not going to develop an alcohol problem. So other risk factors, trauma is a risk factor, exposure, the age at which you start drinking is a risk factor. So in my case, I do have a my parents aren't alcoholics, but I do have some alcoholism in my lineage. My
Oh,
come
interesting.
from a long line of Irish Catholics. I think
Yeah.
every Irish Catholic
Yeah.
family has that in
I
their
never saw
background.
drinking more than when I was in Ireland. That's true.
Right.
It,
And so, but I started young. I started drinking it. My exposure was very young, and also just repeated exposure. So I did have three of probably there's probably four major risk factors, including trauma, and I had four of them.
huh.
I'm sorry, I
Okay.
had three. There's
You
four,
had
and I had
three. You didn't
three.
have the
Yeah,
trauma,
right.
happily, and I'm very happy you didn't. It makes me happy for
Thank
you.
you.
But uh, yeah. Well, it's interesting. On the other hand, I have two very dear friends, mine, including my wife, um, whose parents are alcoholic, and while you think it serves both ways, I think, because yes, it means you have there's a genetic factor, but both the people I know whose parents are alcoholics are not alcoholics specifically because they saw
Right.
what happened to their parents. So
Yeah.
it works both ways,
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, um, one of the things that you point out for you and others, a lot of people, is they find out about this Sinclair method and about naltrexone not from their doctor, but from the internet. And it
Hmm.
hasn't. So, and you want to elaborate on why that is, perhaps?
Yeah. So I think that's one of the most interesting things about it is that the Sinclair method in particular and naltrexone in general. And there are different, I should say, there are different ways to take naltrexone. Not
Mhm.
everybody uses the Sinclair method. Some people just take it daily. There's also a shot. Some people take it just sometimes. There's lots of different modalities. But I don't know if it's most people, but the number of people who are prescribed or the percentage of Americans that are prescribed any medication for alcohol use disorder every year is vanishingly small. It's under 3%, which is actually a huge leap from just a couple years ago.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so most people do not know that these options exist. And then when you're at home googling, how to get sober, you might be lucky enough to come across some information about it, which is how I think most people that I interviewed talked about it just from the internet. There's now a bit more of a profit motive, so there are companies, specifically telehealth companies. So naltrexone is generic. There's not much money in the drug itself, but there are now telehealth companies that specialize in naltrexone.
Oh.
And so I get a lot of ads for these companies now.
Mhm.
There's also a company based out of New York called Or. They're running commercials on American TV, and they have a new product. It's a mint. It's a fast acting mint, which is
Oh.
patented. So they have more of a profit motive than sort of the fact that it's generic. There's not much money in the drug itself, but the mint is patented. So I think that is changing. The message is sort of getting out there, but for a long time, this has been around for decades, and very few people knew that it was an option.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising. Well, well, I want to talk about doctors prescribing it in a little bit, but the next bit of science is the brain chemistry, the science of naltrexone, and also the chemistry of getting drunk. You want to
Mhm.
just go walk us through that the chemistry of getting drunk and the chemistry of what it does specifically, naltrexone.
Sure. So alcohol affects different people in different ways. I sort of before I started writing the book, I sort of assumed that everybody had the same experience of drinking that I do, but it affects neurotransmitters as you would expect: dopamine, serotonin, GABA. You get a rush of dopamine, a
Mm.
rush of serotonin, and then when you start to withdraw, you get waning levels of that. Repeated exposure, it fucks up your brain in various different ways. Um, and naltrexone works by blocking the endorphins, the opioid receptors. So it blocks the endorphins that generally would flood the brain for some people when they drink alcohol. So the experience of drinking on naltrexone is just kind of boring. It's sort of flat. Like when I drink alcohol, I get energized. I get a buzz. Not everybody gets that. Some people get a sedating effect.
Mm.
But for me, it's always been a very high energy experience, almost like drinking caffeine or
Mm.
something like
Mm.
that. And so naltrexone targets that. So if I drink when my opioid receptors are fully blocked and I'm not getting that endorphin rush, it's boring, right? You can still get drunk. You just don't get that euphoric effect. But some people, then the reason that naltrexone naltrexone 10 it works on there's some effect for about 75% of people who take the drug.
Mm-hmm.
About half of the people who have some effect will have really dramatic results, like I did.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, they just drink less, they moderate more, but they don't have the sort of dramatic results. For the 25% of people who get no effect from naltrexone at all, this is sort of unsettled science, but the theory is that they lack one particular allele, or
Oh.
possibly a multitude of alleles that react to the drug. So, and again, this is unsettled science. Everybody's sort of speculating on this. So, you could do, to find out if it works for you, you could, do a genetic test, or you could just try it and see how it
Yeah,
works.
we'll jump ahead. I would plan to go there later, but there's a doctor who had looked at this who actually did develop a DNA test for that allele, LL40 or something.
Yeah,
And,
yeah. He was sort of ahead of his time, though. Um, this is a doctor in Kentucky, and he went to he told me that he went to his post office. He wanted to just get sort of genetic spit test in the mail, and he talked to his local postmaster, and the postmaster said, like, what are you talking about? You can't send biological materials in the mail. And he licked a stamp and said, really?
yeah, and then they said, "Okay." I love
Yes,
that story. Yeah,
yes.
I love that story. Well. So I mean, it does. It definitely appeared, at least from your discussion in the book, that allele, not having the right variant, definitely was correlated to whether naltrexone would work for you or not.
Yeah, and another way to sort of evaluate if people are interested in whether or not it might work for them. So this is information I got from Joe Volpicelli, who I mentioned earlier. So Joe explained to me that to simplify, there are basically two types of drinkers: reward drinkers. So that's what I am. I mentioned that
Mm.
earlier. People who get this euphoria when they drink. Dri- uh, Reward drinkers tend to be binge drinkers. And for people like that, naltrexone tends to work really well. And then there are relief drinkers. And
Yeah.
relief drinkers don't get that euphoria. They get a calming, a sedating effect from alcohol. And naltrexone tends to not work for them at all.
Hmm. Yeah. Again, it makes sense. If you're trying to block euphoria, then if you're not getting
Hmm.
euphoria, then you're probably not doing the right
Exactly.
thing for you. But but when it comes to prescribing, there's one thing that, when in retrospect, seems remarkable. The other, uh, I mean, seems reasonable. The other seems remarkable. Why don't doctors prescribe it? Another thing you pointed out, and it never occurred to me, of course, until you said it, and then it's obvious, is that, well, they're liable, right? If you prescribe someone, here's a drug for you, and you can drink, and
Hmm.
then they drink and something happens,
Yeah.
the doctor's immediately going to say, well, I can't tell someone to drink,
Yeah.
especially when they could,
Yeah.
they could become a binge drinker, and later on I could be
Right.
sued for it, that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
I think that's part of it. There's various other reasons. A big part of it is medical education. So
Yeah.
until very recently, the education that most clinicians, unless you specialize in addiction medicine, the education that most clinicians got about drug and alcohol addiction would be to attend one AA meeting. That was it. If they had that at all. So there was
Yeah.
just a real lack of education on this. That's changed. So now it's a part of the board everybody's psych rotation. They learn about medical assisted treatments for alcohol and drugs. But this is pretty new, and this is mostly in response to the opioid
Yeah, you
crisis.
point out it's really the opioid crisis that helped, in some sense, the alcohol
Yeah,
treatment, because opioids, it's such a generic part of life that doctors are now being, that substance
yeah,
abuse is a big part of medicine, and it
yeah.
wasn't before.
There was also so after naltrexone was approved by the FDA, there was also a black box label warning, which is this, big scary looking box on the drug that basically said that this would lead to I believe it was kidney damage. That was wrong. It was based on studies that weren't that I think it wasn't like actual human grade doses of the pill.
Mhm.
And they actually removed the black box warning, but I think there is some hesitation because people think it's bad for the kidneys.
And okay, that, and then, talking about bad medical education, the thing that surprised me is that many doctors who do prescribe naltrexone prescribe it and say you can't drink,
Right.
which
So
really seems the whole defeat the whole purpose. But
that's the other thing. So most doctors who prescribe naltrexone are not going to prescribe the Sinclair method.
mhm.
They tell people to take it daily. And if you take it in the morning, say, the half-life of naltrexone is like 6 hours. By the time you drink at night or in the evening, there's not gonna be any left in your system. So that's also a part of it, is just the prescribing education that doctors have gotten is inadequate. And I think, within reason, plenty of clinicians are fearful of giving their alcoholic patients permission to drink.
Yeah,
It's a that's a
I would be. I think if I was a doctor, I could.
Yeah.
The minute you mentioned it, I thought, yeah, if I was in that situation, I'd be very careful, especially in this
Yes.
litigious society.
Yes.
And but it's a nice segue because you talked about taking it daily, and there are a number of protocols for taking naltrexone, and there are two, and one is your friend is it Valpolicella? Is that how you pronounce it?
Botticelli.
Yeah, Valpolicella. And versus Sinclair.
Yeah.
Valpolicella protocol is first detox, then
Mhm.
take naltrexone every day,
Mhm.
and 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 whether you're drinking or not, right?
Yes. Yes.
And whereas
Yeah.
Sinclair's is no detox,
Yeah.
only take it when you're an hour before you're drinking,
Yeah.
and don't take it when you're not drinking. The argument being, again, behavioral one, hey, if you don't take it when you're not drinking, you're not blocking your endorphins. Then hey, the not drinking part of your life will be more fun.
Yeah, so
Anyway.
I think so among his patients, I think what he has found works best is just people taking it consistently. So they're kind of not messing around, and they can drink or not drink, right? Most
Mhm.
people who come to his clinic are probably drinking daily. Um, so Joe wouldn't tell patients to take it in the morning unless they were drinking in the morning. I think he would tell patients, take it in the evening or afternoon before your sort of drinking hour begins. But I think for some people, it's just easier to do it every day. I don't think that would have worked for me because I didn't like the effect of the naltrexone. I didn't want my endorphin blockers or my endorphin. I didn't want my opioid receptors blocked for endorphins. I didn't like the way that it made me feel, and so the Sinclair method, this targeted use, meant that I only felt shitty before, and I didn't feel terrible, but I only was getting that effect very specifically for drinking. So I think that just worked better.
Yeah, for you clearly. I mean, especially if you like feeling good, then you don't
Yeah.
feel good when you're yeah. There's two statements in your book that sort of are not conflicting, but it's kind of interesting. In some sense, you say naltrexone is forever because
Mhm.
um, you reach this point called extinction. Why don't you talk about what extinction is before we get there? Mm.
Yeah, so extinction is basically a state of indifference. And the Sinclair method, the term used is pharmacological extinction because it involves a drug. But that's sort of the goal under the Sinclair method, is that you get to a place where you don't care about alcohol one way or another, so that booze noise is quieted. And that happened for me. I sort of called it after 9 months. I did the Sinclair method for 7 months, and then I decided to take a month off of drinking. I never started drinking again. So after like 9 months, I sort of
Yeah.
declared myself free and extinct. So I don't take naltrexone anymore because I don't drink anymore. If I were to have a drink today and I took it without naltrexone, I think very quickly I would fall back into old habits. Very quickly, I would go chasing that euphoria. I think very quickly I would be drinking just as much as I was before I went through this process. Some people do the Sinclair method and they don't want sobriety or abstinence. They just want to drink moderately, and it can work for those people as well. I talked to a lot of people who started out thinking, I just want to drink moderately. I want to drink one glass of wine and not the whole bottle. And they found that after they weren't getting any pleasurable effect from alcohol, they just stopped doing it.
Yeah, a
So
lot
it's
of
sort of
people
a,
who
yeah,
wanted to drink found that wasn't. Yeah, they
it's just
became
not worth
abstinent
it.
anyway.
Yeah, yeah. But I've also talked to plenty of people who did the Sinclair method, who reached extinction, and then for one reason or whatever, they started drinking again without naltrexone, and without fail, all of them within weeks or months were back in the throes of addiction. And when they started naltrexone the second time, when they started the Sinclair method a second time, it tended to take quite a bit longer.
Okay, that's interesting. The second time you become a little inured to it. I didn't know that. I don't remember reading that book. That's quite interesting. But in that
Mhm.
sense, extinction is finite, and for you, therefore, it's finite. But if you plan to keep drinking, this is a forever thing. It's naltrexone for the rest of your life.
Yeah, if you, if you wanna continue to be responsible and safe about it,
Well, especially
some people want to destroy their lives and
yeah.
go back into destructive drinking patterns, and that option exists.
Well, there's a quote in the book. I was afraid it would work.
Yeah,
You want, and maybe that was your quote because you like
yeah,
drinking. I
yeah,
think it was actually. So we want to elaborate on that.
yeah. I think just, I started drinking at such a young age that alcohol was such a part of my life that the idea of living a life without it was almost incomprehensible. I didn't know what that would look like, and I genuinely thought that life without alcohol was gonna be really boring. It's not. It's actually, I have found that it is quite a bit better. It is surprising at how much I like sobriety. Nobody is more surprised about that than I am, but I genuinely feared that, without alcohol, life would be miserable.
Hmm. Yeah, no, and I can see that would be that. You don't want the bad effects, but you don't want to lose the good effects,
Right,
and,
that's
and
what addiction is, yeah.
yeah, that's what addiction is. A part of it also is habit,
Yes.
and you want to talk about that a little bit. When you talk about this, I have to say a quote from David Hume came to mind, which is that reason
Mm,
is the slave of passion,
mm,
and the point is that habits, you have bad habits, but you always rationalize why you have them. So you want to talk about
mm.
habits and drinking?
Yeah, so habits are a big part of the Sinclair method. Um, you can take the pill, but you have to it is sort of the easy way out of addiction, but you still have to work on yourself on and habit change. So for me, once I started taking naltrexone, my drinking gradually over the course of that 7 months declined, and I started incorporating more alcohol-free days into my week, and on those days, I had to find something to do with my time. And so for some people, that might mean taking up new hobbies or starting to work out or a new job or whatever. But it was I was in my late 30s at this point, and I had lived most of my adult life doing most things, not most things, but a lot of my life was spent drunk. And
Yeah.
so I had to figure out what I like to do. I had to figure out how to spend my time. I had to build good habits while trying to extinguish bad ones, which has never been easy for me. I'm not sort
Yeah.
of naturally disciplined. And so that was sort of the self-work part of it.
Yeah, no, once it becomes a habit, and we'll talk about the after you have extinction, the challenges as you talk about later in the book, we'll get there. For maybe this is because it resonated for me. You have a little section called on the M word. Um,
Mhm.
whenever I used to hear the word mindfulness, my mind would turn off. And
Yeah.
I go, not me,
Yeah.
please. I'm not a yoga. No
Yeah.
way. And your reaction was exactly the same. And the reason that I guess I reacted to it is I had sort of a traumatic experience recently, and I began to read about mindfulness and how it could help me, and
Mm.
and, and I was surprised that your reaction was identical. You want to talk about that for a second?
I'm not a mindful person. I
Yeah,
my
me
my
neither.
wife, my wife goes to meditation every week, and she comes back just sort of glowing, and I think, "God, that looks terrible."
Yeah.
I don't like to be alone with my thoughts. I don't like to sit still. I don't like any part of it. Mindfulness, but someone I talked to for the book, this she's a or a Sinclair method coach, and she's on YouTube. Her name's Katie Lane. She did it herself. She talked about when I first started. She talked about sort of the importance of mindfulness, and I kinda told her, I'm not a mindful, like, I don't wanna meditate, I don't wanna do this stuff, and she said, "Well, you don't have to meditate, just try to be more intentional about your drinking. When you're drinking, when you're doing these extinction sessions, think about how the alcohol makes you feel.
Yeah.
Think about the taste. Do you actually enjoy it? Do you actually enjoy it? Are you having a good time right now? Just sort of observe your surroundings, and just sort of be more conscientious. And so that's how I interpreted this. So I still don't meditate, and I don't think I ever
Mm,
will
me
meditate.
neither.
Yeah, God forbid. Um,
But the difference is I mean, I have a job. My job, my whole life was to be alone with my thoughts, right? I
yeah,
love being in my I love getting lost in them. But
Yeah.
what mindfulness guides me is to step back and say, well, what are you? Why are you doing this, or what are you thinking? And
Right.
that's useful. And why am I saying what I'm saying? I mean, I love
Right.
to get lost in thoughts, but it's nice to
Right.
step back and say, okay, well, what exactly are you doing, and how are you feeling
Right.
when you're doing it? And that's not so bad.
Yeah, I think for meditation, to me, the thing that's such a turnoff is that you're not supposed to think at all. You know, you sort of observe a thought and you let it
Yeah, I
go.
know.
And the
Yeah.
goal is the sort of platonic ideal of like the empty brain. I find that extremely challenging.
Well, one of my favorite jokes from a friend of mine who I mean, nameless, is that he doesn't like he didn't like meditating because it got mellow and then he ripened and then he rotted. Anyway, uh, um, let's talk about the importance of alcohol-free days. You
Sure.
talk about it for you, but I think uh, um, not just to see that you can enjoyment without alcohol, but also it seemed to me to measure the efficacy. I mean, if
Hmm.
you talk about it for a bunch of people, and everyone always seemed to say, when I was reading it, I realized they talked about their alcohol-free days and the number of alcohol-free days they had, or how long they were. And if you're doing this, of course, and it's behavioral, you want to see progress. And so
Right.
one way to target it is to label your alcohol-free days, don't you think?
Yeah, and that's another reason. So one important element of this is tracking your drinking.
Hmm.
And so there's apps for that. You can use a spreadsheet or whatever. You could just write it down. But it tends not to be a linear process.
Yeah.
And so for me, I kept a spreadsheet and I would chart it and there would be spikes and valleys. But it was really helpful to see the trend lines was down. And so alcohol free days is a part of that, and also a part of relearning good habits and just sort of learning to live your life without alcohol. Because if you've reached a point where you need something like this, you probably have alcohol's probably intertwined in so much of your life that you do sort of have to live without it.
Well, and it also seems to me, again, if I were thinking of me, that a day is manageable. A lifetime isn't, but a day is. And so it
Yeah.
seems like the first step is possible, at least, and to see
Right.
what, like, yeah.
Yeah.
You want to mention who Claudia Christian is and what her relevance is?
Yeah, so she's an actor. She's an American actor, sort of most famous for Babylon 5. And she had a fairly successful career in Hollywood in her 20s and 30s, but she had a really serious drinking problem and tried to get sober, went to rehab and detox, did all of these things. And her life was really, really falling apart because of alcohol, just a terrible binge drinker. And so at one point she went into a detox, and when she left against medical advice, but when she was on her way out, she saw a flyer for a drug called Vivitrol. And Vivitrol is basically a naltrexone shot. It's quite expensive. You take it once monthly. It's not the Sinclair method, because the Sinclair method, is this targeted. You only take
Mhm.
it when you're drinking. The Vivitrol, the shots in you for as long as it
Yeah.
lasts. So Claudia, she went home and she started doing some research, and she found an article about it, and she found that the active ingredient of Vivitrol was naltrexone. She reached out to a company to try to get it. Or the company that was on the flyer, she reached out to them, didn't hear back, and ended up ordering naltrexone from maybe Thailand or India or a place like that. And she did the Sinclair method just sort of on her own, and it was really effective for her, and she became a spokesperson for the Sinclair method. So she started an organization it's now called Option Saves Lives. It was called the C3 Foundation, but they've changed the name. She's a coach, so she works with people who are doing the Sinclair method. And she's written 2 books about it. And she did a TEDx talk in London in maybe 2015, 2014 or so. And the title of the talk was something like, um, the cure for alcoholism, or something like that. Something very catchy. And she talked about how this saved her life and how this quieted the booze noise, and so she's become really key in this effort to reach the public consciousness. And I should say, so Claudia, in this TEDx talk, she said that her problem in life, like, it wasn't trauma. She was sort of like me. She had like she had a physiological addiction, and she drank so much she got addicted, and that's what she thought at the time. And when I was interviewing her for the book, she said that she was wrong about that, that she wished that she could take that back because she realized now that she actually did have trauma. Her elder brother was killed by a drunk driver when he was young. She was sexually assaulted. She had sort of a history of dating the wrong men. She had some bad shit in her past.
Yeah.
And so later in life, she did sort of go back. She didn't do therapy, but she did a lot of self care and sort of mindfulness and stuff like that, and sort of did address what for her were root issues. But yeah, so she's more than anybody else. She's really been responsible for spreading the word about the Sinclair method.
Yeah, no, I think it's great to know that she's been doing that.
Hmm.
One of the things you talk about that intrigued me is that I view it as a double-edged sword. But you were talking about the fact that with naltrexone, a lot of alcoholics, and we'll talk about extinction bursts and things like that, have relapses. I mean,
Hmm.
it's typical, and as you say, the progress isn't linear. Um, and so but the good thing about naltrexone, unlike maybe I don't want to say unlike AA, but if you have a relapse, you just start again with naltrexone. It does
Yeah.
you just start taking it again, which is
Yeah.
a great positive for it. The one thing when I read that made me think is that, but well, that gives you solace if you instead of the guilt and the
Right.
trauma. But also the question is it does it give you an excuse to have a relapse? Well, look, I can always relapse because I can start again.
Yeah.
Is it a negative feeling too?
I think the problem with in Sinclair method circles, people don't use the term relapse. They talk about drinking non-compliantly. It sets you back. Like if you repeatedly drink non-compliably, it's not going to work for you. If your brain thinks that it's going to get a hint of that euphoria, it will keep seeking it out. So it's really important to adhere to the protocol and to take it 100% of the time. I didn't take it 100% of the time. I probably took it 99% of the time, and I didn't have major setbacks. But if you talk to people who do not commit for whatever reason, or who even don't wait the full hour before they start drinking, they don't reach extinction. It doesn't work. So that's the thing. I mean, you could use it as an excuse to seek out that old high, but it's not going to work for you. You're basically wasting your time.
Now, what speaking of that, two things. One, explain what an extinction burst is because I thought that was
Yeah.
intriguing.
Yeah, so I didn't experience this, but for a lot of people who were going through this process, after several months, maybe even years of drinking with naltrexone, of following the Sinclair method, they'll experience a sudden and unexpected surge in the amount that they're drinking. And so I've seen lots of drinking logs and charts like this. Where it's a downward trend, and then after a year, this spike where they're drinking for maybe it's once, maybe it's twice, maybe it's for a couple weeks. They're all of a sudden drinking way more than they had over the past, I don't know, past weeks or months. And that scares people for a good reason. You think, oh, it's not working. What happened? This was working so well and now it's not happening. This is typically called, and this is not scientific. I don't think anyone has studied this, but people in this world tend to call this an extinction burst. And they basically explain it as like this is your brain's last ditch effort to try to seek out that old euphoria. So you start drinking so much, your brain is basically trying to force its way back into that state. And then if you keep doing it, if you just work through it, oftentimes people reach extinction and a state of indifference soon after that.
Yeah, no, it's nice to know that it's good to mention it's there because that would scare me, yeah, if I was in the
Yeah.
process. And as you point out, it's not linear, and that's why it's important to track it and to
Yeah.
visualize. Visualization is a big thing, but if you can see a picture and visualize
Yeah.
that you're going down, it really makes a difference. But 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 other than this burst, you talked about not being compliant, and you do give a you. There was one notable episode where you weren't compliant accidentally, right? You wanted to leave.
Yeah, I forgot my naltrexone, and I had been looking forward. I was going into Seattle to meet a friend, um and I forgot my naltrexone, and I thought, you know what, I'm just like, fuck it, I'm just gonna drink. And I did. I went and I drank. I went to a bar and I drank too much, and I went home and felt like shit the next day. But it didn't, I just sort of got back on the wagon. I felt terrible about it, but I got back on the wagon and recommitted to the process.
Yeah, so
And
for you it was
yeah.
quite dramatic. Just I don't know how much it was psychological either. It's hard to know, but just not taking naltrexone. you immediately overdrank the next time you drank.
Yeah, but not to I didn't
Not
black
to
out. It
you not
wasn't
blackout,
I
not
think
to that
I
extent.
think I did wreck my bike on the way home. Um,
I think you did. Yeah,
yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to remember the episode, but it's
Yeah.
not as bad as there's another experience you related, which I found the difference between that and the way you were before. You actually talk about during your drunk period, you actually quit a job because there was a new beer coming out. Okay.
I mean, I think it wasn't a new beer, it was because it was happy hour. My favorite beer was on sale. I would do that sort of shit all the time. I worked in minimum wage, sort of menial labor for most of my 20s, and I did not take employment seriously.
Okay. Yeah, well, I thought that was great. Oh, I'm not gonna. You had someone call in, I think, and quit the job for you because your
I
favorite
did.
craft beer was
I
going
did.
on happy hour that day,
Yeah.
which I thought was
Yeah.
that's tip. I mean, when you hear things like that, I think that's personalized. This. I want to depart from this for a second because a question came to me, um, and you talk about it at the end of the book. You don't talk much about your wife Jana in throughout the whole thing because you kept it secret from her. Your drinking
Mhm.
secret from her, and I found that first of all, I found that remarkable. First of all, because we talk about the fact of how alcoholism hurts your relationships and affects your families, and we'll talk about that even near the end. How much beyond the individual, and I know it again from my friends who've had alcoholic parents, how much it affects them. But your wife, you didn't get your wife involved, which is remarkable because one of the things that makes this system work often is to have this support, as you talk about. But do you think what you don't say in the book, which occurred to me, is that she must. I mean, I'm amazed if she didn't suspect. It's almost like you're going to ask me about Epstein or something. But
Mhm.
uh, did you, when you talked about her afterwards, and she was very supportive and really happy that you'd done it, did she ever suggest to you that she kind of knew what was going on, but didn't bring it up?
No, she didn't know.
She didn't. You just hit it so successfully.
Yeah, and this isn't that uncommon. If you talk to people who have the secret drinking is a very common behavior among alcoholics, and you hear about people hiding alcohol. It's yeah,
Yeah.
and I
Okay.
think in her case, she had no. It wasn't just that she had no reason to expect. It was like as unexpected as if I had been going out and doing heroin. There was just
Yeah.
it would not have occurred to her.
Wow. Wow. That's great. Well, that's says something about you and something about the two of you. That's great. Um, I assume your relationship is better, or after alcohol, or is it?
Yeah. I mean, it's not our relationship wasn't bad in the beginning, but yeah, it's there's a weight off of my chest for sure not having a secret.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's always. Um,
Mhm.
now, getting back on the track of generalities, in the reactions of there are critics of naltrexone and this, and they're who are dubious. Some of them, of course, are people who AA has worked for them, and you talk about Jordan, a guy named Jordan, who AA worked for, I think. But before you talk about that, I think it's interesting as an alcoholic when you talk to him, you when it's clear that he had this life-threatening experience that changed his life and he now is now sober, and he was or before he was a drinking pal of yours, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
You
The
resented him.
bartender, yeah.
You resented him
Oh,
for
yeah.
being successful.
Oh, yeah. I think that was in my heavy drinking days, anytime anybody got sober, I was resentful of them. It felt
And
like an affront,
do you
Like,
think
what
that's
how could
common
you
because does
Yes.
it make you feel worse about yourself, or
Yes.
is that the reason
Yes, and it also is a reminder that it is possible to quit.
that
And
you haven't?
why aren't you doing it? Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah, okay. But then but he did react negatively. He didn't believe because his own experience of what his own experience was. When you talked about Sinclair meth with him, he didn't buy it, right?
Right, right, yeah. Yeah, and I don't think that's an uncommon experience either among people who got sober through AA. Um, I'm sure that he spent a lot of time around drinkers who had convinced themselves that they could moderate, and then eventually they end up back in the exact same position.
But you do point out to make it clear that AA is less. I mean, you point out at the very beginning, AA said there are other opportunities, but even over time, you claim it's less dogmatic now than it was before. and AA in
Well,
general.
rehab is. So
Rehab.
rehab is less and not every rehab. I'm sort of generalizing here, but you have companies like Hazelden and Betty Ford, and they are now incorporating MAT and drugs like Suboxone in treatment for opioid use disorder.
Okay, but that's good to know. But one of the other bits of resistance comes from medical community because the protocol is not, even though it works, it's not proven in the sense of the gold
Right.
method, which is
RCTs. Right.
random controlled trials. Um,
Right.
and you want to explain that for a little bit?
Yeah. So it's sort of a question of technicalities.
Yeah,
So there have been if you search PubMed for the Sinclair method, you
yeah,
won't find any results.
yeah.
If you search PubMed for targeted use of naltrexone, you will find results.
You want to
So
explain the difference? Because when you talk about it, you don't explain the difference for what they mean by targeted use.
it's basically the same thing. So the targeted use of naltrexone is not taking it daily. It's taking it just before you drink. And so that's the thing. I think there can be almost some snobbery among researchers in this field, um, because John David Sinclair, he patented his technique,
Ah.
and what he patented was not like the final form of what the Sinclair method was. Um,
But I mean, the point is that there's a lot of data, and he has data. There was this
yeah,
Finland data of 147 people. 115 of them reduced their drinking from 37 a week to 9 a week. 3% had a goal of abstinence, but 26% stopped drinking. So there's clear evidence that it's working. But what random controlled trials are is that you give naltrexone to some people and a placebo, and
yeah.
and and one of the reasons that you point out that this wasn't happening is that um, why wasn't this happening with the Sinclair method? Because he was working with rats.
Right, right. He was a researcher. He wasn't a he
Yeah.
was an animal researcher. And there have been the when I wrote the book, I don't know if this is still true, but when I wrote the book, the most recent study was out of I think it was UCSF, and it was basically the Sinclair method, the targeted use of naltrexone, but it was specific to gay men, with moderate to or with I think moderate alcohol use disorder. There were all sorts of sort of factors you had to qualifications to get involved in the study. So I don't know if we could extrapolate much to the general population there. But I've talked to a lot of clinicians, I've talked to a lot of people who've done it, and the numbers that they give are generally this works for about 75% to 80% of people.
And again, behaviorally it makes sense. The only bone I would pick, and the reason I do this is because my first wife has worked with behavioral techniques with autistic
Mm,
kids, and positive reinforcement versus negative reinforcement. You talk about positive reinforcement and negative and you say, well, and if you do negative things, people want to do it less. But that's not what negative reinforcement is. In a sense, the Sinclair
right.
method is negative reinforcement.
Yeah,
Negative
it takes
reinforcement
away
is
the
is
right.
is 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 encour- is strengthening behavior by removing unpleasant experiences. And
Right.
and that's
Right.
really kind of what it is, not imposing the unpleasant experience, but removing
Right.
them strengthens the positive behavior. And I guess that's the behavioral thing. It really is, right? It's not giving the
Yeah.
positives, it's removing the negatives.
Right. Yeah. It's Sinclair. I mean, he was a Skinner guy.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, and I heavily influenced him when I was younger. When you're talking about this guy Cox who did this specific gene allele, and now has developed this DNA test. Something that you said resonated with something I've been thinking throughout the whole book. I was thinking, here's a way to make naltrexone more popular. He used it to stop overeating, and it occurred to
Mhm.
me, the minute I kept thinking about this is that diet pills are like everywhere. It's the big thing, but if it's really if it's targeting the same kind of thing, couldn't and I don't know if people have done it, but obviously it worked for him. But couldn't naltrexone be used as a diet pill? And if so, why not?
I think it could be. As far as I know, there have been no clinical trials on this.
It would
And
make
now we
it much more
have
popular and much more,
ri-
yeah,
right, but now
lucrative.
there's alternatives that seem to work really
Yeah.
well.
Okay.
And also, food. Maybe it could work for binge eating, right? You take it before um, a particular like if you're planning on having a binge eating session. Although I don't know if people plan binge eating sessions, um,
Yeah, I don't
but
plan.
Right, right, but
Don't.
because the half-life is sort of short, I'm
Mhm.
not sure it would work all the time,
Okay.
as opposed to something like Ozempic,
Sure.
you know?
Okay. But anyway, it occurred to me as one way to make it more popular and maybe more
Yeah,
expensive.
yeah,
Um, other thing is that there are other drugs. It's not just naltrexone. And one of the things you point out is Antabuse, which basically makes you sick when you drink. And one of the
yeah,
people you talked about named Thomas basically combined the two, right? A carrot and a
yeah.
stick, he called it. You want to describe that a little bit?
Yeah, so this was someone who was really struggling with his drinking, and he found that, that Vivitrol, so Vivitrol kinda took the actually, no, did he do
I think
I'm trying to remember if he did Vivitrol or if he did the pill as well. He found that Antabuse is a drug. This was the first drug that was FDA approved to treat
Mhm,
alcohol use disorder. It's been FDA approved since either the 50s or 60s. It's been around for a long time, but it makes you really, really ill when
mhm,
you um when you drink on it. And for various reasons, it's been really underprescribed. In the beginning, the dosages were really high, so there were actually
mhm.
cases of people dying from taking naltrexone, or I'm sorry, not naltrexone, Antabuse. The dosaging has been modified in recent years, so as far as I know, there's no recent examples of anyone dying from it. But it kinda scares people off
Yeah.
because if you drink any alcohol, even if you have food that has alcohol in it with Antabuse in your system, people can have really, really negative reactions. Like, you get so sick you feel like you're dying. Um, and
Right.
so but it works really well for some people. It works really well. For some people, it's just like, once this is in your system, once you take it, but the other issue is that, like naltrexone, you have to comply. It's also a pill, and so a lot of people just stop taking it because they wanna drink, and you have to wait several days or a week to get it fully out of your system, but that's an issue.
Okay. We talked briefly about families, but um, one of the things you say here is that there are many. This worked for you, and of course it's different for different people. But even though AA, a big part of AA is the support group. Naltrexone, you don't need the support group, but if you look at the cases of people who've done it, having the support, having families help, all of that helps with this whole
Mhm.
procedure if you can get
Yeah.
them involved.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that one of the
And
things you recommended with families watch is something called One Little Pill.
yeah,
Is
that's
that
Claudia Christian. Claudia
yeah,
Christian made
and
a
it
film about
works
it.
for
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and I don't know if it's still the case. You say rehabs are not so bad now, but a friend you said recently went to rehab. The rehab had never heard of naltrexone.
I
Which
think that's very common, yeah.
That's
I
still
mean,
very common?
I think that's changed. There's a lot more open-mindedness about drugs, and it depends on the rehab as well.
There's one of and I want to get back to finiteness because there's a quote in near the end of the book where someone says we're an unusual community because other groups want you to be a member for life. We love our members. We want them to get better and move on with their lives. So
Yeah,
this is finite for you. It was finite, unless you continue to want to drink, in which case but the whole idea, which is kind of interesting, is that it if you go to that abstinence level, which you've gone to, unlike AA, where you presumably even after you're abstinent, for the rest of your life, you go to AA meetings. In this
for some
case, once
people.
you are, you're done.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the goal, at least. Um, I think for people who run these Sinclair method groups, for them, it's not about sort of restructuring your identity in your life. The idea is that you just do it. You have a problem, you treat the problem, and then you move on with your life. And a lot of people, go to AA, quit drinking, and then stop. But some people go to, quit drinking, and 30 years later, they're still going to AA every night.
Yeah. Well, I want to close off. We've got only a few minutes left. I want to talk about your own experiences a little bit more, and then give you the last word, literally.
Sure.
The Your own extinction experience went from April to December. Right? You said 8 months in the book, but 8 or 9 months. But then you had to deal with and it was not linear, but the effects of dealing with the fact that you weren't drinking. And I was amused by one, which was that um, uh, uh, you learn the great effects of not drinking and the joy of doing all sorts of things, which is wonderful.
Mhm.
But one of the bad ones was that you realized that you couldn't blame your bad qualities on alcohol
Mhm.
anymore. And
Right,
I
right.
thought that's, but on the other hand, it seemed to me that's a good thing too, though, because it
Yeah.
says, well, then you can't. That means you have to do other things to solve them, right? But
You gotta find other people to
but
blame,
it was
other
so
things to
easy to
blame.
blame everything on alcohol, and
Right.
now you have to deal with it.
Yeah.
Um, but there's something that you said on a quote on page 141, which really resonated with me, which was, you went to lots of events. Some of them, you did everything you could do, and some were terrible, but it was just great to be there. You see, I didn't really care if they were terrible. Without alcohol dominating my thoughts, I felt like I was fresh out of prison. And
Mhm.
I'm I ruminate and I'm so obsessive. I think all the time, and sometimes I get in a rut, and that feeling of just when all your thoughts don't turn back to the same thing, some negative thing, which you can get caught up in a rabbit hole, and suddenly it seems like you're out of prison. Suddenly your mind is free, and suddenly you have so much more time. Everything you
Right.
try and do is so much more easy, and so that must have, in your case, was alcohol. But anyone who's obsessed with anything at some level, when they're freed from that obsession, it's
Yeah.
just such a lovely experience.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And but nevertheless, you have to learn how to do things. You met people. You don't seem that shy, but you met people with alcohol, and you have to learn how. And a lot of people have to learn how to actually suddenly meet people and have
Mhm.
fun without alcohol. It's not easy if your whole life you've been depending upon it. You want to elaborate on that a little bit, your own experience, and
Yeah, I found that for me a great way to meet people's dogs. So I recently moved. I'm in a new community, and I found a great group of people who meet every day to walk the dogs on the beach. They're all retired, so I like that. They've got lots of time during the day. So just finding sort of getting out of my comfort zone in terms of who I would think my peers would be. Um, yeah, it's easier for some people are more social than others. It's easy for some people to just go out and make
but
friends.
apparently it's
But
pretty common for a lot of people. They've relied on alcohol for their opening them up, making them more talkative, but also that was their friends. And you point
right,
out
right.
eventually you learn that actually, and so originally it's the alcohol that's fun, but eventually you learn actually the people can be fun.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the benefits of AA is especially for heavy drinkers who need to get out, break old habits, whether they're using naltrexone or not. AA provides that sense of community for people.
Yeah, no, but nevertheless, I mean, I think that near the end, you stress that what strikes you at the very beginning of this book is drink your way sober. It is counterintuitive to think that you have a methodology that can help you stop being an alcoholic by drinking, and I think it's as
Right.
long as people realize that's shocking, but it works. It's kind of remarkable. The Before I give you this last word, and I want you to think about someone, but you talked about health and human services. I can't help but ask: has RFK and the presence of that has that affected any of the approach towards naltrexone or substance abuse or anything?
I don't know. That's a good
No.
question. I mean, they've cut funding for so
Yeah, I
much
wondered.
unless
I
you're like
wondered.
a
There's so
beef
many
company.
ridiculous things that they're
Yeah.
involved in. I wondered if they were hurting or helping this
I
area.
don't know. That's a
Okay.
good question.
I want to. I was taken. You talk about Hank near at the very end, and
Mhm.
it made me again resonated with me because I was thinking of my wife's father, who I never met, who was an alcoholic and died before I met him. And throughout the book, I kept thinking, "Wow, what if?" Talk about Hank for a second, and then I want to, if you don't mind, read the last paragraph of your book.
Yeah, so this was a friend of mine from I was in my early 20s at the time. He was probably in his early 40s when I met him. And he was a raging alcoholic, very charming man. I knew him from a bar where we were both locals. He was the super in my building for a while, and I once walked into my kitchen and he was standing there. He had used his keys to open the door and steal my laundry detergent. Um, and he was a really smart guy, sort of stalled professionally. He was very working class. Hadn't his actually his father he looked like a logger. If you met him, this is a word. He looked like a mechanic, right? But his father had been a linguist, and his mom had actually been a nun. So
That's
he yeah, he was raised in Bloomington, Indiana. His father had been a professor there, so he was he came from less humble beginnings than he ended up.
yeah.
And he drank himself to death. He ended up getting cancer. He also was a heavy smoker, so that might have had something to do with it. And I thought about him a lot when I was writing the book, and what his life might have looked like had he known that something like this existed. And it might not have been any different. I think he was in great denial about his drinking, um, and maybe nothing would have changed, but maybe there was that
I
possibility.
think yeah, and I think all of us know some people like that. We think of it, if only, that had been that their life might have been like. I was wondering
Yeah,
after that. I actually looked back at the beginning of the book to see if maybe you dedicated to Hank, but he might have been a good
I did
person.
not. Yeah,
But let me finish by giving you the last word, and that means me reading it.
sure.
Last paragraph of your book. Of course, there's no answer to these questions, no way to know. But I hope there's a future where my fellow drinkers, the inebriates, booze hounds, the winos, the lushes, the alkies, the drunks, all of us suffering from alcohol use disorder, or whatever you want to call it, realize that there's not one path of this problem. There are many, and for some of us, David Sinclair was right. There's not just a treatment, there's a cure. And I think it's a remarkable thing to learn, and it's so important. And I hope that people listening, this may affect people. But I found it lovely, and I knew I'd have a lovely time talking to you. I hope you had a lovely time too. Uh,
I did. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
it's great. Thanks again, and I look forward to being on your podcast too sometime. But you take care.
You too. Bye bye.